If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Hunters, woodsmen, and forest dwellers, have you ever encountered unknown entities, strange creatures, or paranormal beings? What's your story? I saw a real demon. I recently went up to a buddy of mine's ranch house in Centerville, Texas, and we saw this super tall and white muscular creature/entity with glowing eyes, and it peeks at us from behind the surrounding forest. My friend lives on over 400 acres of land and his ranch house is surrounded by a forest basically. Anyway, we saw it every single night from the window of his house. It makes absolutely zero noise when it moves, and we only see it when it's dark outside, so I cannot describe any physical features it has besides its height and the broad shoulders of it. It actually really scared us, and we slept in the same room every night with our hunting shotguns next to our beds, and in the morning when we would go to the area we saw it at, it was like nothing was there. It is very weird and unsettling. When the creature moved, it would seem to be in a low crouch/all fours position, I think, but when it stood up, the eyes would shoot up in height like an NBA center was standing in the distance. We really don't know what to think. If anyone had a similar experience or knew what it was, then please feel free to enlighten me, and yes, I know it wasn't a deer or owl. This thing has a human-looking body with intense glowing eyes and weird movements, almost like it was a robot. It had such stiff and slow movements. This all happened when I was a kid, but the other day I was telling someone this random childhood memory and realized how incredibly weird it was. My grandma used to own this small section of wood. We'd go out there often in the summer, the adults would sit around and have some drinks and snacks, and the kids would go out and play. The area had small patches of woodland, surrounded by farmland. One day my cousins and I were walking along a dirt path, woods on one side, open farmland on the other. That section of wood was owned by someone else, so we never went in there, just walked by it. We were just casually chatting, pointing at a shed they had in there because it looked like the one my grandma had. Suddenly something came storming through the woods. Sort of winding around the trees, running at us. My best description of it now would be a centaur. The front of it was pretty big, like the size of a very tall, buff adult man, and the back was much shorter and looked like some kind of animal, like a deer. There's a lot of bushes and undergrowth there, so as a normal human, running through there at that speed was just impossible. We all freaked out and ran back to the adults. We all told them pretty much the same story of what we saw. Some older cousins came back with us to see if they could identify the creature, but there was nothing there. The wooded areas are small, thin strips, so there's not many wild animals there. Mostly pheasants, hares, and the odd small deer. The farmers nearby kept cows and horses, which we'd seen often enough before, and this definitely didn't look like them. It was a very different shape and size. Anyone know what on earth we saw that day? My ex and I were going camping, and I found a spot not far out of town. Since neither of us have been there before, I accidentally drove past the campground and went down a logging road for a few miles. It was getting dark, and I realized we should turn back. I obviously missed it. So I stopped the car and do one of those 6-point turns in the middle of the dirt road. On our left is a steep hill going down, on the right is a hill going up with tree stumps and some bushes. Well, as I'm turning around, on the hill going up, we both see a naked, very huge dude with a smaller person on his back. They were just standing there in the bushes, and when they noticed us, they started stampeding down the hill toward us. Both of us freaking out, and I finally complete the turn around and speed the FK out of there. We went straight back into town, about 20 miles away. We didn't go camping that night. To this day, I would have thought I imagined it. I could not tell if it was an actual person, and my girlfriend confirmed she saw the same thing. Second weirdest thing to happen to me in my life. It's crazy how your brain just dismisses events it can't explain. If my girlfriend was not there, I would have forgotten it happened. This was about 9 months ago, and I think about it a lot, and I've been wanting to share it for quite some time. Months ago, I decided to sneak out of my house to meet up with an ex-boyfriend of mine. My driveway is very long, and I live in the middle of the woods, about 10 minutes away from the nearest town. He drove 20 minutes, so I had to leave to make the trek to where he was picking me up. We have a Ring doorbell, and to dodge the said doorbell, I had to go along a trail into our woods. Nothing in our woods is out of the ordinary, it is simply private property with 2 trails you can choose from, which both will eventually lead to the open road if you know where you are going. I set my phone and watch on the counter so for the morning after, if my parents checked, they wouldn't see my location and my whereabouts. I am about 5 minutes into walking, and I hear weird screeching and almost screaming noises along the trail. I can't see anything, I just know I am on the trail, as I've done this many times in daylight. I hear this for a few minutes, and I run and look behind me even though I cannot see anything. Weird, but I brush it off. I come back, and I get dropped off to walk back on the trail. As I'm walking, I'm giggling and talking to myself, and something cold grabs my ankle and isn't letting go. I scream, but it was 2:30 when I was dropped off, and I guess at this time it was 2:36. No one would have been up to hear me, and clearly I was far enough away to not be heard from my house. It felt like I was being dragged down from a cold hand lying in the bushes and shrubs in the woods by the trail while I was screaming. My ankle is let go, and I hightail it as fast as I can make it through the roots of the trail and make it indoors. It's gotten more fuzzy each time I think about it, but nonetheless, I wonder sometimes what that could have been that grabbed me. If you have any ideas, let me know. Okay, this actually happened in February of this year. My daughter had a friend over, and they asked if they could go for a walk in the woods together. I told them yeah, but only gave them 45 minutes to play. It was pretty cold. I made her take her little sister too to make a bigger group. Then, 45 minutes came and went. I started to worry. I called both my daughter's phones but never got an answer. So I decided to go look for them and took my phone in case they called. There is only one way in and one way out of the woods where we live, so I was sure I would pass them if they came out while I went in. I went into the woods and began calling for them by name, shouting as loud as I could in case, for some reason, they got lost going off the trail and needed direction. About 3 minutes later, I heard the three of them shouting for me from what sounded far away and much deeper in the woods. I ran towards the sound of them calling out Mom. But whenever I thought I was close to them, their calls would get further away. I had gone in as far as I was going to go without getting lost myself when I began to get paranoid. Something was seriously wrong. My phone rings. It's my daughter. Relief floods me as I ask her to describe her surroundings to me so I can find them. She tells me, Mom, we're at home. Dad said we just missed you. We've been calling your phone for the past hour. Why didn't you pick up? To me, it had only felt like 15 minutes. Panic began to strike as I looked at my situation in a whole new light. It's getting dark fast, and I'm by myself, following voices that sounded like my kids but weren't really my kids. Like I was being lured out by someone or something. I had to ask her the obvious. You mean you're at home? Just as I said it, I heard my kids and their friend calling out, Mom. Over here. And my daughter was able to hear it as well from over the phone. My daughter screaming told me to run. So I did. It felt like it took forever to get out of the woods, but in reality, probably only a few minutes. I stayed on the phone with my daughter while I ran. Hearing the voices call out to me the whole time, my daughter was more scared than me and almost hysterical by the time I reached home safely. There were no missed calls, and I never saw the kids on the trail coming or going. It was like a time lapse. I had been in the woods over an hour, and it really felt like minutes. Except when running home. I still don't know who was calling me that day, but at least I wasn't going crazy because my daughters and their friend heard the voices as well when she put me on speaker as I ran home. It was traumatizing. We don't go into those woods anymore. I do a lot of camping and hiking all over the western US. Oddly, my only paranormal experience in the wild occurred in my own hometown. I live near the beach, in a town on the back side of a large bay, separated from the ocean by a sand dune strand about 5 miles long. At the very back of this bay is a forest of eucalyptus trees, and just to the north of that forest is a massive eucalyptus growing all on its own. The branches hang down to form a kind of half-dome around its base, and it's a popular spot for teenagers to have a fire, camp, and do illicit teenager activities. Local kids call it Ghost Tree, probably for reasons that are about to become clear. My friends and I were down there one night, having a little fire and sitting around being boisterous kids far enough away from town not to bother anyone. During a lull in the conversation, we all hear, very clearly, a young girl call out hello. Everyone freezes. Again, this kid calls hello? My friend stands up suddenly and stares at a bush about 10 yards from us for a second, then starts booking it back towards the main woods and the trail out of there. The rest of us took just long enough to kick out the fire before bolting off behind him. Turns out, the first friend who took off had spotted a pair of eyes staring out of the bushes at us. There's a neighborhood that backs up against those woods, and I know a woman who used to live in one of the houses with windows that looked out directly into the trees. Whatever that thing is back there pretending to be a little girl, everyone who lives nearby has seen or heard it, and they all get a distinctly hostile vibe from it. I no longer go back there anywhere near sunset. This experience is one I never shared with anyone besides my brother. When I was about 13 years old, I was living in rural BC. One night I was in the hot tub on the deck outside just watching the woods, taking in the silence. It was winter time, and we just recently had a snowfall that left around knee-high of snow. It was around 2 to 3 a.m., and out of nowhere this very large wolf, bigger than one I have ever seen by far, came out of the woods. I remember its coat being a shimmering silver and its bright, piercing green eyes. As this wolf was walking along the fence of our paddocks, it locked eyes with mine, and we just kind of stared at each other as he walked past me, both alone in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. What happened next till this day instantly makes my spine shiver. As the wolf walked past, he walked towards our barn with our horses in it. It became darker as it entered the barn, but the other side of the barn still had a bright light illuminating the outside that I could clearly see. This wolf, as it entered, halfway through, went from the shape of a wolf to a very large, broad-shouldered person. The horses didn't make a single sound, and this person that now stood roughly 7 feet tall rounded the corner towards the open field but didn't emerge from the other side, and I never saw it again. My brother had his own encounter with this same wolf. I'm guessing, he told me that he woke up randomly one night from the feeling of being watched. He then looked out his window to see a very large wolf walking away from his window, so I'm guessing it was watching him sleep. This place we lived at was old native ground. Our barn was an old schoolhouse where the Catholic priest would put the native children and teach them lessons on Christ. It even had the old desk and chairs inside still. My brother and I both saw children's faces in the panes of glass from that barn and lights turning on randomly. We had closet doors slam repeatedly for minutes at a time, footsteps, and feelings of being watched. In my room, I saw glowing red eyes on the ceiling, and I hid under my covers till morning. Anyway, my main subject of this story and what I'm more seeking answers for is what I encountered outside in the middle of the night. After I looked around myself, the closest thing I could find was skinwalkers or wendigos, but from what I read, these creatures have deformed features or things that make them uncanny or straight up horrific. What I saw, nothing struck me as abnormal about this wolf besides its massive size, until it literally changed its entire form in front of me. There's just so much that I experienced at this property that this just scratches the surface of everything. The wolf incident is just something I've never really been able to grasp and always wanted some kind of answer because it feels and sounds unbelievable. I also understand that the term skinwalker is Navajo lore and doesn't correlate with BC tribes, but this is just a representation of what I saw with the closest accuracy. My parents have a nice house in central Georgia, and when they go out of town, I usually stay there and watch their cats. This is normal for me to do. One night, I think actually the last night before they were supposed to come home, I was smoking a cigarette. I still smoked cigarettes back then, on the back porch, which is raised up and looks down at a retaining pond and a wood area. Full moon, so I could see into the woods real good. So, I stood there looking into the woods and smoking like a chimney. It was then I saw the first bits of movement, darting in and out of the trees. I thought, hey cool, there's a deer or something out there, and I began to look for it so I could see it again, not deer. I saw what looked like a person at first, scared the crap out of me, and flashed back to horror movie after horror movie. Some dude outside your house in the woods at night does not equal good things, not a person. The proportions were wrong, arms and legs that were too long, had a weird shape, it looked like a twisted mutation, like someone tried to make a human and failed at it. Then I saw movement in a different area and I noticed another one. At this point, I had run to my parents' room and got my dad's rifle. I didn't want to engage them. Oddly enough, I didn't feel threatened, but it had a scope to it, and I could get a better look at what was going on. I wish I could have gotten a better look than I did, but they were silhouetted in the moonlight. Weirdest things. They seemed to be somewhat social and would occasionally interact with each other. Never seemed to care about me at all, though I think they knew I was there. Description pretty much what I had said. Height I guesstimate at nearly 5 feet 10 inches minus 6 feet, looked thin but solidly built, long arms and legs, and somewhat of an oddly shaped head. There were maybe 3 to 4 of them, if I counted right. I haven't seen them again. Creepy late night experience. Warning to those who are easily freaked. Don't want to discourage anyone from trekking the wild. I'm a hunter, mushroom forager, etc. Bottom line, I do a lot in the wilderness. So tonight I went scouting for a hunt. As I came up to a cattle guard in my side-by-side lights, I hit this individual holding a beer by the gate. I hop out and ask if he's okay. He had no light, nothing, and doesn't even look at me. 40 minutes later, I'm coming back to my vehicle. I close the cattle gate and hop in my car. This guy just walks up to the gate I just closed, opens it up, closes it, and walks into the dark without a light. Nothing. Mind you, I'm a mile into the wilderness. I call out to this guy, and he walks as if I didn't exist, with no light and a dead look on his face. Freaked me the hell out. His blank, ominous demeanor was something out of a horror movie. I have had quite a few negative experiences in this area. Something in the woods. This incident occurred when I was approximately 13 years old. I am now 36, I haven't told anyone this story before. When I was young, my family and I used to go camping multiple times every summer. This particular time we went to our favorite campground in NH. My mom and her best friend chose the campsite at the far back of the campground. We were set at the back, which turns to deep forest for miles. There were campsites in front of us but not beside us. The first night we were there, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'd say 2 or 3 a.m. I had to use the bathroom. Because of how dark and silent it was, I didn't want to have to walk to the campground bathroom, so I decided to relieve myself outside the tent facing the forest. I knew no one would be able to see me if I went there. This still brings tears to my eyes and chills down my spine just talking about it. As I was relieving myself facing the forest, I saw a black outline of what looked like a child, I'd say about 4 to 4.5 feet tall, leaning out from behind a tree and staring at me. I was paralyzed with fear. The shadow figure kept slowly peeking at me from behind a tree, then returning back behind the tree. I watched it for what felt like 5 minutes, but it was probably 30 seconds. There were no facial features that I could make out, no eyes, not anything, but I know something was watching me or trying to get me to go into those woods. Once I finally snapped out of my fear paralysis, I ran so fast around the front of the tent and dove back in, zipping up the tent as swiftly as I could. I hid crying in my sleeping bag, trying to make sense of what I saw. I never heard anything or saw anything after that night. But it puzzles me to this day. What was out in those woods that looked human but child-sized at that hour of the night? I'm not sure if I want to know. Appalachia. I'm not going to be of much help because all the stories my grandpa told me were just these one-offs, and they weren't really connected to like known cryptids. He told me one about things like a house whose doors wouldn't stay shut. People would put chains with padlocks on them and would come back the next day, and they'd be wide open. Or about mysterious sounds like screaming women or girls off in the distance. I have heard this could be adult or juvenile bobcats. Most of the stories he told me had some explanation. He told me about a weird light his family noticed every night that ended up just being a reflection, or about the screaming being bobcats potentially. But the one story that always really scared me because he had no explanation was one that happened when he was a boy. He was born in 1940, so I guess this could have happened anywhere from the late 40s to the mid-50s. He, his dad, and others were out hunting raccoons. I can't overstate the ruralness of this area. The entire county will have literally 3 traffic lights in 2023. So you can imagine 70 years before that. So the dogs were out. Trailing? My experience amounts to watching where the red fern grows, but they heard their howling stop in the distance, and then not long after the dogs all came rushing back to them, scared to death, and wouldn't leave the ring of the lantern light. Then he described another noise coming from the direction the dogs had been in. It's been 30 years since the last time he told me the story, so I can't remember exactly the words he used to describe it, but I remember coming to the conclusion that the sound they heard was a cross between the trill of a screech owl and like a howler monkey. The noise in the distance was moving straight towards them. The way he described it was almost like a steady, rhythmic movement in a straight line, with the periodic noise to mark its progress. As it got closer, they could tell it was up high in the tops of the trees. He described it as moving from one tree to the next. I'm not sure if he ever said swinging, jumping, or flying. But he never described any noise other than the vocalization. No wings, no leaves, and no branches. And he never really attempted to embellish. There was no big climax. He said the thing came right at them and never changed its speed or direction. It went right over top of them and the dogs and paid them no attention. And they could listen to it proceed into the distance away from them just as they did its approach. He said he never seen or heard anything like it ever again despite countless nights in the woods, nor did he ever hear anyone else describe anything like it. Growing up, I lived in the middle of the woods. No neighbors for about a mile on each side, and we owned 60 acres of the forest, then a swamp after that. So basically, I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I'm an only child and both of my parents were out of town, when I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball, and the bump would make me throw it almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored it. After the 4th or 5th time of it happening, I thought, well, this sucks, I'll just go home. Walking back, I felt uneasy, but I knew I was just freaking myself out because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I are at home on the couch when the garage door opens and he starts barking. I hop up to go let in my mom or dad, even though they were home really early. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut, and no one was in the garage. Quieting Max down, I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. Nothing. No response at all, so I go out to check the door, and it's still locked. Okay. Sure. Weird, but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I know I'm not crazy. About 20 minutes later, I hear the door open again, and this time Max starts growling like crazy. I quiet him down again and just assume it's the wind or something making noise, even though by this point my heart is racing. I hear footsteps come up the stairs and think, oh geez, Dad really is home this time, and hop up and run to the door. It starts to jiggle, so I run faster to let him in. I peep through the hole, and even though my hand is loosely around the jiggling handle, there's no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I go hide on the couch with all the lights on. Max is still growling. About an hour after that, I start to feel a little better, even though I'm still terrified, and then I hear the door handle jiggle again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way out is through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask these questions to make myself feel better because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes are drawn to the huge, heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, okay, ghost. If you're real, you'll shut this heavy door. Nothing. A minute goes by. Nothing. Max is still sniffing around. I turn around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I hear click. I whipped around and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind, for sure, had to be. I proceed, okay, ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open this massive door back up. Nothing. I relax a bit and then squat down with my head and on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I just was being scared when I hear click-clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, locking every door in the house. For the next 4 hours, I would hear the footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m., my dad walks in and yells at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about it until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken, and I asked him what was wrong. He said he aimed at 2 deer but missed both completely because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. Brown mountain lights. I read about them in an old book from the 1950s about Appalachian folklore when I was 12 and became dead set on seeing them in person one day. To meeting my husband at 32 years old, who was just as fascinated, and we set out to witness them together. We've now seen them in person many times. The first time was the most impressive. I bought a booklet called The Brown Mountain Lights by Ralph Layell at the Little Linville General Store on the way into camp near Wiseman's View. Best place to view them. High clearance vehicle to get there, BTW. I sat and read the little paper booklet out loud to my husband as it got dark. Highly recommend trying to find and read this story. Anyway, as it got dark, a white light appeared down in the gorge, almost fading in and out at first. I pointed it out, and we watched it. Then, almost as if communication were happening, more and more appeared below us down in the gorge. They'd blink and move about in a manner that could not be explained as a hiker with a flashlight or any other man-made existence I could come up with. A red light on Hawk's bill appeared and rose up into the sky and disappeared, with a couple of green lights near. My husband and I both witnessed all of these. This next one happened so quickly, my husband missed it, and I've not seen anything else like it on any of our subsequent trips back. On the horizon, looking at actual Brown Mountain, the most fascinating thing I've ever seen appeared from the side of that mountain. It looked like the lights of a Ferris wheel, with a center blue-colored light where spokes of green light came out, with a red ring around. It was turning, like a Ferris wheel, and rose up over the mountain and disappeared. Truly incredible. I can't even describe the wonder I felt seeing that. Now is the perfect time to see them with no leaves obstructing views. Just after dusk is supposed to be the time they're most active, which is when we've seen them the most. We camp when we go, so we're spending extended amounts of time out there in the dark. So, last summer, my then boyfriend, now fiancé, had planned a trip to visit Hocking Hills in Ohio for a weekend to get away. We both love camping and being away from the craziness that is our lives. So we rented a really cool cabin. If you're familiar with the area, it's way set back, but it's 2 stories, full bathroom, kitchen, living room with TV, Wi-Fi, massage chairs, lol, etc., and cannot forget the hot tub. So one evening, after a long day of hiking and then celebrating with drinking/eating, we decide to hop in the hot tub. It was getting dark, so we decided just a quick relaxation session and then right to inside. About 5 minutes into us being in the hot tub, I heard a noise. The way most of the hot tubs sit is facing the woods. Like 3 sides are wood, then one side faces the cabin you stay in. So I heard a crack in a branch. And for my man, I kind of frozen and looked at him. He laughed a little and said, "Oh, must be a small animal." I let it go. But very shortly after, these noises started to get closer. And whatever it was started to make a weird crying noise. Kind of sounded like a dying coyote mixed with a snarling dog. It was so weird. It was far away at first. Then it got closer and closer. The only reason I knew I should worry was because my guy was not okay about it. Usually he's relaxed, calm, and collected. It sounded like it went from the ground far away to being high up in a tree and right the duck behind us on the ground. Whatever it was, it snapped a branch right behind my right side. The door to inside was just 3 feet away from the hot tub. So my guy looked at me and quietly said, "Get the duck inside." I know we were far set back in the woods. It's Hocking Hills. We're close enough to Athens to maybe run across bobcats. But it was so strange and odd. It was like whatever it was smarter than us and tried to sneak up on us. I'm sure it was an animal of some sort. But that was the first and only time that my fiancé has said, "That's the only phenomenon that I cannot rationally explain." It genuinely scared the absolute duck out of him. Mostly just because of the sounds. We both grew up in rural areas for part of our lives, and I lived on a rural farm for a few years. And none of these noises were natural to either of us. If anyone has any opinions on what that creature could be, please let me know. This happened to my cousin and me when we were young teenagers, about 14 to 15 years old, so it would have been around about 1999 to 2000. We were camping as a family, my aunts and uncles and lots of cousins, on Norris Lake in eastern Tennessee. We would usually spend about a week camping raw, as my uncle called it, meaning just pick a spot and pitch your tent, so we weren't in an actual campground. We always chose a place locally called Matty Beach, which could only be reached by a 4-wheel drive vehicle or on ATVs, so it was an isolated area. Because we always stayed for so long and had so many people, we had a designated bathroom area, located a few minutes walk away, with a tarp draped up for privacy. My cousin and I were the only 2 girls, so we had our own tent, and an ironclad rule of my uncle's was do not wander off to use the bathroom by yourself after dark. So one night my cousin woke me up to accompany her to go pee, and once we got there, I decided I might as well go too since I'm already there. We're both squatting next to a tree when we heard the woods go silent, a split second before we heard something big come crashing towards us through the woods. It was very loud and not trying to be quiet at all, and whatever it was moving fast. We froze and looked at each other and hurried up to finish peeing. As I was pulling my pants back up, I whispered, "What is that?" Before she could answer whatever it was, it just stopped dead, like it had heard us. We just stood there clutching each other in fear, listening hard for it. When we finally heard it again, we realized it was trying to sneak up on us, like it was moving much more slowly and quietly now but was still coming towards us. After a couple minutes of that, it stopped moving again, but we just felt like something was watching us. We couldn't see anything watching us, but we for sure felt it. We stood there terrified, for I don't know how long before we decided to bolt back to the campsite without looking back. We got back to camp safely but never saw what was stalking us. The next morning we told my uncle and took him to roughly where we had first heard it coming from. There was a clear back trail that he was able to follow for quite some time, disturbed undergrowth, and snapped twigs and branches, the highest of them around 5 to 6 feet off the ground. No footprints though, which is what he was looking for because he had his own reasons to believe in a Bigfoot-type creature in the area. I know that's kind of anticlimactic, but we honestly don't know what it could have been. There are black bears in the area, but this isn't typical behavior for a bear, and a bear is not going to be breaking branches 6 feet from the ground. We were not and have never been scared of the woods or scared of the dark and had made dozens of nighttime bathroom trips before and never had this happen before or since. Something was watching us that night, and I don't know if I'm more relieved or disappointed that we never actually saw it. My last walk through the long grass. There's places I've been where I will never go again, and here's one of the last of them. I'm going to go back 30 years or more to a day in the summer holidays where I found myself alone. I'd walked my girlfriend home, and it was the time when the lights started to fade and the night started to close. It would have been around 8 or 9, it was still quite light, and looking back, there was no need to be worried about anything. But, as is the case with many things, the worry started anyway. I took a short cut through a park, which led me onto a path that cuts through some woods. The light was good enough for me to walk the path and stay on it to the other side. I've talked about the feeling of something watching you, and if you take anything from reading this, it's that the feeling you get is rarely wrong. Mine is never wrong. As I walked down that path, It opened up into a small field full of long grass, yellow-colored as the sun had been quite merciless with it, when that feeling struck me hard. Now I was at an age where I thought I could handle anything, so I stopped and surveyed around to see what or who was there with me. That's when I heard a sharp whistle. The kind where a dog would come running. I looked around to see where it had come from, but there was no one there. I just started to walk again, thinking the whistle must have been carried from the park. Then I caught something from the corner of my eye in the grass. A streak of white was just slow enough for me to catch. I whirled on the spot, but there was nothing there. I shouted, "Hello?" No answer. So I carry on walking. I'm getting nearer to the far edge of the field now. And I heard, clear as day, literally to my back, "You're not leaving so soon?" I turned again to nothing there. Fear is a funny thing, and the realization you could be in trouble coupled with fear is a horrible thing. Now I've always been told from being very young that nothing can hurt you that's passed on. So armed with that knowledge, I just carried on walking. I was scared, but I hunched my shoulders with my hands in my pockets and watched my feet glancing up for the gap in the fence to get out of there. Only, it wasn't there. I don't know how, but I must have turned around one too many times and threw myself off by quite a ways from where I should have been. So now I'm a little more scared. I'm not prone to irrationality, so this was not right at all. And on the breeze, I heard a laugh. More of a chuckle, maybe. I started to jog, this time keeping my line on the gap in the fence. And I fell down. I say fell down, it felt more like I was tripped, but maybe that was adrenaline. My memory gets a bit hazy there, because in the dying light I swear I saw a man. Just an outline silhouetted by the setting sun. But he was there. Dog at his feet with a long walking stick like a shepherd's crook. I sat up, and for the first time in my life, I realized my family weren't as crazy as I thought they were. It's a humbling experience. And I bounced onto my feet like Jackie Chan. I shit you not. And that jog turned into a dead sprint. I knew in my head and heart I'd seen something that wasn't right, and I needed to get out of the way as fast as my legs would carry me. The very last thing I heard or thought heard was, "Don't be a stranger, lad." There's places that should really be left alone as the things that want you to come and visit. After that, even with my friends hanging around in that park, I felt watched. I'd look down that path, and I swear I'd hear laughter. They built some warehouses on that land, so I suppose it's not somewhere to worry about these days. I still tell my boy about things like this that happened to me, and he rolls his eyes and sometimes laughs. I might take him there one day and see what happens. Just to see. One of mine is when I was out in the forest hunting with my cousin. We were about 14 miles into the middle of nowhere, second day into the hike. We were setting up camp in the middle of the night when we heard a woman screaming. Yes, I realize mountain lions sound like women screaming sometimes, but not in full, clear sentences. "Help. Please help me. Ah." Blood-curdling cries for help. Out in the dark, terrifying woods. We were both law enforcement at the time, so of course we go to see what's happening and if we could help. We followed the direction of the sound, but it kept getting further away. We'd call out, "Stop moving or stay where you are." The woman kept repeating the same thing over and over. After walking into the thick timber for about 10 minutes, dropping glow sticks to show the way back, we heard her voice very close. It was coming from an abandoned mine shaft. I did not want to go anywhere near that thing, but my cousin persisted. We got to the opening of the mine and flipped on our rifle lights, and I swear to God we saw a set of pale, white eyes draw further back into the darkness. It was silent. No more cries for help. No noises whatsoever. I hit my Garmin emergency locator to call a life flight, which showed up about 2 hours later. Search and rescue went down the tunnel and said it was a dead end. No signs of life, blood, clothing, etc. We told them everything we experienced, and one of the guys on the flight crew said, "You're not the first one to report stuff like this here." Bigfoot hunters. I work at Vega State Park in CO as one of their seasonal rangers. One day, I was manning the VC, and this lady walked up with some question or other. We have a bunch of stickers in a basket where people check out, and one of them happened to be in the shape of a Bigfoot. This lady stopped mid-sentence when she spotted the Bigfoot stickers. "You guys have Bigfoot here?" she said. "Not that I'm aware of, ma'am," I replied. Turning to the man behind her, "Kevin, they have Bigfoot here. We have to get the team out here." "Oh, God, I thought they're loonies." "Ma'am, we've never." "Where was the last sighting? Would you mind if we conducted an interview through your campgrounds?" At this point, I am imagining the rest of the weekend doing nothing but answering questions from disturbed campers about Bigfoot sightings and keeping tabs on a team of Bigfoot hunters. They even gave me a business card for their paranormal investigation team. I decided to handle matters. Pulling out a park map and a map of the surrounding area, I point out Park Creek Road, which is a fire road leading away from the park and 30 miles into the Grand Mesa. Hundreds of square miles of forest and rock, perfect to send a couple of Bigfoot hunters. Like I said, ma'am, I have never seen or heard of a Bigfoot sighting in this area. However, if there were Bigfoot, they would be up this road and in the wilderness surrounding the Grand Mesa. Snatching the map away from me, she continued to talk about the team and walked out the door. They were never seen or heard from again. I'm assuming they either found Bigfoot or had a lovely time on the beautiful Grand Mesa. Either way, they were away from the park, away from where they could cause a ruckus. This story is set in August 2012 in Adirondack Park, New York. Specifically, Bear Mountain, located close to Tupper Lake. I was 17 years old and had gone on a 4-day camping trip with my girlfriend and her father. Brought canoes and everything. Her dad was an avid camper and always got the best spots well in advance. The spot we were on was the last spot before the entrance to Bear Mountain Trail, right on a small alcove of water, so the rest of it was state land that was uninhabited and very dark. About 11 p.m., we were having a fire and just about to go to bed. All of a sudden we hear a woman pleading with someone to stop it and saying, "Somebody, please help." This was coming from state-owned land and was about a football field away, it sounded. We all looked at each other like, WTF? Her dad runs down to the water and starts yelling, and then there is a splash in the water and a help. And then silence. He starts yelling, "Can you hear me? And who the F is there? What are you doing to her?" My girlfriend is yelling for her dad to come back up and away from the water as it was pitch black and she thought someone was going to attack him next. Her dad gets in a canoe, and is trying to shine a flashlight in the water. He realized quickly this was a bad idea and came back up and told us to drive to the ranger station. As we got there was another couple who had heard it too and said it sounded like someone had been murdered. We agreed. My girlfriend was in complete terror, and we rushed back to the campsite to check on her dad. He was there, and then within 10 minutes there were troopers and rangers searching the mountain for hours. They had boats come in and even a helicopter with a spotlight. Nothing ever showed up. And no one was ever found. Her dad said it was complete silence. You would have heard someone either swimming or walking through the woods to get out. The GF and I are no longer together, but when we have seen each other out, we always talk about it. It's something that bonded us. Her dad still talks about it too, and he is the one who speculated that it could have been paranormal. So I would like to start off by saying this is a true story, and it happened a few weeks back during the youth hunting season on September 28 and September 29, 2024. This might not be a horror story to some, but to me and my brother it very much is. My brother and I went to Hoosier National Forest to go hunting for youth season. There's a section of road on 446 heading northbound that is a keep right except to pass area. In a section of the woods just south of the Hell on the Hill haunted house. We walked in without a guide rope since we know that it is only a couple miles in each direction to a road. My brother and I had picked a spot to hunt a few days prior to the start of the hunting season, and we were trying to find our way back to that location blind with only a rough location on the map. We ended up entering a little too far north and walked just a little too far north and west in the woods than we had intended. Quite frankly, we were a bit lost, but we have a decent sense of direction, so we knew where the road was and about where my truck was. My brother and I got into a disagreement about where the spot was, so we decided to head back to the truck to regroup and figure out where we needed to go. On our way back to the truck, we came across a thick section of woods with a bunch of fallen trees, and we didn't think much of it since we have gone camping, hiking, and hunting our whole lives. In my 21 years of life, I had encountered maybe 2 trees falling in the woods but never near me, and I had only heard them from a distance. We stopped to take a break at the top of a hill and on the edge of what I'm going to call the fallen tree zone. I took sips of my water. It's important to know that the wind was blowing southeast. We were standing northeast of the fallen tree zone. My brother asked me to check my map to make sure we were on the right path to the truck, so I did. As I pulled up my map, we heard a crack, crunch, creak. We turned to look in the direction of it, thinking it was further in the woods than where we were standing and thinking that since the wind was not blowing in our direction we would be okay. We were sorely mistaken when I saw the tree falling right towards us. My brother yelled run, we took off, and about 3 seconds later the tree landed less than 2 feet from my brother's right shoulder. When I say tree, I'm not talking about some 10-foot sapling, this was a full-blown 50 or 60-foot tree. We took that as a sign to get the duck out of the woods for the day since we didn't know where our spot was. We went home and went back to bed knowing we would try again tomorrow. The next day we parked a little more south, I'd say about a quarter mile or so. We walked into the woods about a quarter mile west and then half mile south. We found a nice spot on top of a ridge overlooking a nice open creek where we set up shop for the day. We sat out in the woods for about 3 hours without seeing or hearing any living creature other than one squirrel. We should have taken that as a sign, but we did not, as it was the last day of youth season and I really wanted my brother to get a deer. About 3 hours into our sitting, we hear a crack, crunch, and creak. We look northeast of where we were and see a tree about 20 to 30 feet away from us falling. This one didn't fall right towards us, but there are like 400 trees in the woods, and we were in a lively section of wooded area with very few downed trees about a mile away from the first day's incident. The tree was loud, and my brother yelled because of some slight trauma due to the day prior. So we decided to call it a day and head back to my truck. On our way back, we discussed how unusual it is for two trees to fall near us or towards us on two separate days of the week in completely different sections of the woods. Something evil or angry didn't want us out there, and we felt it. I would like to hear if some other people have had a similar experience or if I'm just crazy. I grew up in northern Idaho. This isn't my story but my dad's. My dad and another guy were out in the woods hunting. They decided to split up so my dad was by himself. He said after walking for a while he started to get a really bad feeling and felt as though something was watching him. He's had run-ins with mountain lions and moose and such and said this felt different. He continued on, hoping for the feeling to go away. Then he suddenly heard a loud banging coming from up the hill, like something metal being hit over and over again. Mind you, this isn't a hiking trail he's on. He's in the middle of the woods hunting. Thoroughly creeped out, he turned around and went a different way. Later, when he met up with the guy he was with, he said he had heard the strange banging too. I know it's not a lot or very scary, but my dad spends a lot of time in the outdoors and said this was one of the only times he's been really creeped out because the banging sounded so odd and out of place. Even if it's just another person, sometimes those are the worst to run into. I used to be adamant about always bringing my compass with me. Just to be sure of my bearing and have no question about if I was turned around or whatever. This one particular trip I forgot to bring it. No big deal, I'd hunted this spot before. Fast forward to the end of the day, and I spot a monster, mully, a few draws over, and even though I know I'll be pushing daylight, I head out there in a direction I'd never been before. Well, I was rushing and had buck fever, and wouldn't you know it, after a couple hours I'm not sure of my direction back to camp. I'm not too bothered, though. I had overnight emergency gear, so after ducking around for another couple hours, I decided to stock up and make a camp and spend the night and pick things up in the morning. Well, shit, it dumped snow overnight, so there was no way I could backtrack on my tracks, and without my compass, all I could do was decide on a direction and go for it. For the better part of that day, I became increasingly unsure of where the hell I was. I was out of snacks, had been hiking knee-deep snow all day, and was starting to worry a bit. Nothing I came across reminded me of the familiar area I had hunted so many times before. I made a fire to warm up, gave myself a pep talk, stood up and walked about 100 yards into the bush, and there, hanging from a tree, was a compass. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, but there in front of me was a compass. Holy smokes. What a stroke of luck. Turns out I was pretty turned around, but with the compass, I dead reckon my way over the top of a small mountain and down the other side to familiar territory and my camp. To make it all worse, I was hunting solo, so it would have been a couple more days before search and rescue would have become aware of me being lost. That compass is now a family heirloom that my kids always had anytime they went out. Crazy stuff, I still can't believe it. Forests are scary. Myself and 4 friends were camping in central/northern Ontario, Canada, one random weekend. It had been a beautifully hot and sunny summer, and we'd never all been camping together, tons separately, but never together. We drove in separate cars because we had to leave at different times. In fact, I was driving my parents' caravan at that time. Anyways, I'm driving myself and 2 of my closest friends, listening to some Dallas Green and some Jack Johnson. Just inducing the chillest of vibes for our trip. We finally make it to the campsite, and our other 2 friends, my now friend and his wife, are already there with their shite set up, a fire going, and some dinner being prepped for us. It was pretty sweet. The first night nothing eventful happened, but the second night got weird. We'd been up drinking since basically breakfast and had a pretty awesome day. We'd been boating on a small lake and had tried a hand at fishing, but the lake was essentially barren. We'd gotten back to our campsite, gotten a little bit more tipsy, and made ourselves a wonderfully burnt campfire dinner. Party started going all over, and we were close enough to one of the major beaches nearby to hear the insane party that was going on. We were too drunk to locate it and make our way there, but we didn't care. Well, I kind of cared because around 1 in the morning my buddy and I went to go to sleep in our tiny little tent, and we couldn't because of all the music and potentially girls we heard screaming infrequently. Now, here's where things get weird. After a couple of tosses and turns, neither of us can sleep. My friend and I are just shooting the shit, whispering, when all of a sudden we simultaneously realize that we can't hear anything outside of our tent anymore. Then this weird buzzing sound is being emitted from what seems like somewhere in the sky but appears to be relocating at a ridiculous speed. For example, top right corner 1 second, right beside us the next, top left corner thereafter, etc. This strange buzzing went on for what felt like maybe 30 or 40 minutes. We were entirely freaked out. There weren't any lights or anything, and we didn't actually feel anything nearby, neither metaphorically nor physically, but it was there, and we heard it, and it had a transformative effect on our brains. And we both heard it, which made me feel more sane. The sound eventually faded, and the sounds of partying slowly made their way back to their normal volume. Like when you bring your television down to 0 and then gradually increase the volume. Kind of like that. It's not how normal sounds are supposed to work. Granted, they hadn't been working at all. But I digress. Eventually the music and unfortunately the girls started to dissipate, and I eventually fell asleep. I woke up suddenly, and as a lot of people here describe, something felt off. I moved ever so slightly to see my friend lying on his back with his eyes wide open, and we both looked at each other and slowly nodded. Neither of us said a word to each other. Suddenly something brushed up against my side of the tent. Of course. At this point, my mind is racing with fear. And then we hear a very low, guttural sort of sound. Not really a growl, so to speak, but kind of like if your stomach made noise, but deeper, and if you could do it on purpose. I guess. It pretty much tilted me right then and there. Whatever this thing was continued to hang around our tent. At some point it made distinct breathing noises, and then what sounded like maybe sniffing? Either way, we were royally freaked out. Whatever it was eventually left, and we started freaking out to each other because of what had happened earlier, and now we're being sized up for kill by a giant black bear, as far as we were concerned. But then the sounds took our adolescents' brains in a different direction. Like, what if those sky sounds were something completely different and had left someone to check everything out before it left? Gah! Sleeping was rough for the rest of the night. I was happy, kind of, to have awoken to the sight of a black bear and a bear cub on a distant ridge about 400 yards away. We all stopped to gawk for a while and appreciate the majesty of bears. I have a strange affinity for bears. Sorry. We'd been prepping breakfast and taking our equipment down when my friend brought up the noises and animalistic sounds from last night and expected everyone to kind of say, yeah, wasn't that weird? But no one had heard anything. Anything. They only heard the partying and had fallen asleep after it had all started to dissipate early in the morning. So for what felt like 30 minutes, we were hounded by this weird, fast-moving sound that projected an incredibly strange buzzing sound that cut the rest of the world off from us, and then were harassed by strange bears, and no one could corroborate what we were feeling. It was really freaking strange, and my simple brain can't think of anything as to what the buzzing could have been. I'll accept that the second set of sounds was potentially the bear, despite the fact that it didn't sound like any bear I'd ever seen or heard before. But I was tired and a little more than happy with my alcohol consumption. Needless to say, forests can suck just as much as they can be awesome. Anyone else experience anything similar? It would be cool to see if anyone else heard some similar creepy, world-cutting off buzzing. Alright, this one's odd, and I'm more curious if anyone has experienced something similar to this. Took our sons fishing. It was a lake we had been to too many times. It's in a national forest. A bit remote, but you still see occasional hikers and campers. Everything was great for the first couple hours, but after about the 4th hour of being out there, I started hearing this weird noise, almost like boots on wood behind me, so I've got my line in the water, and I keep looking over my shoulder like I'd be able to catch this mysterious boot and mysterious plank of what it was stepping on. But really, not much of a surprise, I never saw anything and eventually started to ignore it. About half an hour went by, and all of a sudden there was this music off in the distance, and it sounded like gospel, but I couldn't make out any words. I assumed it was coming from the road, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how removed from the road we were. Our car was far away but still within eyeshot, and it seemed like this weird gospel-sounding music was coming from that area. The kids were ready for lunch, and I left all the food in the car, so I thought no better time to figure out why my car is playing music. My husband never seemed fazed by this in the slightest, so I felt kind of crazy hearing it, but my sons did too and were just as curious as I was. So we made our way back to the car, and I realized it was in fact not my car at all. This music was loud and only got louder the closer we got to the car, but it sounded like it was all around, like wearing headphones. We're standing at the car at this point, which is completely off, radio off. So we're just standing there, we're all stuck in place trying to pinpoint where this is coming from, and even though it was loud and it did sound like gospel, you couldn't make out a single word, but you could tell it was a woman singing. I have no clue why, but I got this incredibly bad feeling, so I told the kids to get in the car, and as soon as I backed up to go get my husband, the music just stopped. No fading into the distance, no, it just stopped. I got back to my husband and told the kids to stay in the car, and I said, I think it's time to go. That music made me feel like I was about to get jumped by a cult, and my husband started laughing, and he said, I heard it too. I thought it was coming from the car, but thought it was odd you'd be listening to gospel, so I told him I had a bad feeling and wanted to leave, and he felt we did do a lot of fishing and that leaving earlier than we wanted wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. We left, with no answers and me having a bad feeling for no reason. But I still find it incredibly bizarre and only take comfort in the fact that all four of us heard it. I can't describe how unsafe I felt. Even though I've been in woods my whole life and have never really had a bad feeling or felt unsafe, this was different. As we were leaving, there was no vehicles, no people, no visible hikers, nothing at all, and that somehow made this whole thing worse. Has anyone ever experienced music way out in the woods? Probably 10 years ago, me and my cousins were in Serbia, visiting the little village my mom's came from. There's really nothing there to do for a few kids or teenagers except go to the center of the village, pet some stray dogs, or play soccer in the concrete yard near the old school. Our property was surrounded by a lot of fields and forest. So, naturally, we would go into the forest and do some stupid stuff, for example, ignite some wood or paper. We definitely had a favorite spot near the swamp. There was a clearing, and some old trailers were parked there. My mom told me that people used to live there, so we used to play around and inside of the trailer. One summer we went to that clearing but realized the trailer was gone, but there were still some metallic parts laying around in the grass. It looked like someone had blown up the trailer. Like I said, the trailer was parked right at the beginning of some swamp area. Still, there were some trees though. Wooden figures were attached to the branches of the trees with a string. A pot filled with soil hung on a branch, and a small plant sprouted from it. It immediately reminded me of the Blair Witch Project, in which the group also finds weird figures in the woods. But us being kids, we didn't really think too far ahead and started destroying these figures. We didn't really think about it for the rest of the day. Night falls, and me and my other 3 cousins are sharing a room, Therese only my aunt and uncle in the same house with us, in a different room though. At night, it was pitch black. I remember thinking, this must be what it feels like to be blind. We stayed awake until 2 a.m. watching some trash TV. A few minutes after we turned off the TV, we heard the garden door open up. The garden door is pretty old, so it made quite a distinctive sound. All of us laying in the room heard how someone started walking in circles just right in front of our window, which was like 50 centimeters off the ground, so it was pretty low, you could easily look right into it by day. The sound the footsteps were making was as if someone were wearing slippers. It was kind of a dragging, I don't know the right word right now, sound. Every time we stood up and looked outside the window, hoping to see something in this dark night, the sound stopped. We repeated this process a few times, and then me and my cousin were brave enough to actually go outside. It was super quiet, you could only hear the water in the stream babbling far away. It was a pretty creepy night because that sound continued the whole night, just someone walking in circles in front of our window. The next morning, of course, I told my mother the whole story, from breaking the figures in the woods to that creepy sound in the middle of the night. She started telling me a story of when she was a kid. There used to be people, she called them Bigfoot people, so I guess just very hairy people, who were cast out into the forest by the villagers. These outcasts would go into the villagers' front yards and steal corn or chickens. So, my mom's guess was that they're still living somewhere in these woods, and they wanted to scare us because we broke something that belonged to them. I have spoken to my cousins about it, they don't really remember the whole thing as well as I do. One even said it was just a fox who got lost in our front yard. Even though there was this sound of someone walking around in slippers, I actually got shivers from remembering this story. Anyone from that area had a similar experience? My family was on vacation in BC to visit some family. It was me, my mom, and my 3 siblings. We were driving through the creepy mountain roads to go to the hot spring, looking for animals and stuff along the way. But I'm very interested in the occult, New Age, paganism, literally every strange subject under the sun. So I'd picked up this used deck of tarot cards because I was pretty young. So we're driving, and suddenly this weird black figure darts down the mountain and across the highway. It bolts down the embankment and is gone in seconds. We pass the spot, it just went down, and it's a straight drop down to rapids, and there is absolutely nothing ducking down there. I'm talking like easily a 100 to 150 feet drop. People have died going over those corners. But my mom and I both saw it and looked at each other like, did you just ducking see that? She asked me really quietly if it was a straight drop or a hill. My siblings were pretty small, so we didn't want to scare them. But one of my siblings pipes up in the back once we hit the top of the mountain and asks us if we also saw that weird thing run across the road. We thought bear at first, but it was long and lanky. If you guys remember the cheese string mascot guy, but it was exactly shaped like him. Just a void instead of cheese. Second one, this isn't my story but my grandma. She and my grandpa have lived in the mountains for decades. They used to mushroom pick every single year. My grandpa has lived in those mountains for probably, I'd say, over 50 years. He used to detonate the dynamite when they would blast the mountain. So he's very comfortable in the area and knows all the best spots for mushrooms, wood, berries, and fishing. You name it. You have an idea in mind, and he will take you to it. So he took my grandma to one of his favorite spots. It used to be a town, but there's very little evidence it was ever even there. My grandma is a witch. I can't explain it, but we've all got her creepy genes. She can feel death on a person and call it to the ducking day. She can feel everybody's emotions all the time. She can feel illness on people as well. She's saved people's lives with her creepiness, and she's called people's deaths. She's a very sensitive person to these things. So they're going through the town and picking, and suddenly my grandma stops in a small square. This particular square has such a feeling of dread, sadness, fear, rage. Every terrible feeling is overwhelming her all at once. It makes her physically ill and makes her feel such an impending sense of doom. She tells my grandpa she wants to go. She hates this spot, and she doesn't know why, but something is foul there. But he tries to brush it off and tells her there's some graves nearby of children that died from, I think, scarlet fever. You're probably just feeling them. But she insists and tells him they need to go. So they go back into town, and my grandma is asking some of the historians in the area, and finally one of them knows the square in the forest and the history behind it. She starts to talk about the spot in the woods, and she tells him he's going to think she's insane. To her surprise, he immediately starts to describe the spot in detail and he knows exactly what she's talking about. There was a town there once, and there was a really kind prostitute that lived there. She would buy all the flowers from the little girls in town so they could go home early, help out with money, and was well liked throughout the town. But one night somebody broke her door down, and they ended her with a hatchet. The murderer wasn't caught, and the town burned to the ground the next day. There wasn't a single building left untouched by the flames. The square that my grandma was talking about was the actual spot where she was ended and was found. The town was never rebuilt, and eventually the forest grew over the last pieces left. We went and saw the graves of the children one time. It was the saddest feeling, but such a gorgeous resting place for those sweet little guys. The clown in the woods. This story happened in 2016 during the whole clown thing, and this is my story. Now I was still kind of young, and I liked exploring. Going into sewer forests, anything I could find I would do. Me and my friend one day were walking through the woods near his house that we found scary. The reason it was so scary was because there were paintings on the trees, not graffiti. It looked like someone actually spent time on these, but they were very off-putting, but it was a cool area. We would go by this massive tree that had steps drilled into it so you could climb it, and it also had a big door painted on it. One day we got bored of sitting there, so we decided to go looking around an area we hadn't been to. And we came across this little area with a red stool and a recliner. We went to the stool and messed around with it and jumped on the recliner. Just having a fun time. Then we heard a honk like one that would come from a clown nose. We looked around and heard it again. We looked, and then I saw a clown poking his head up from this little hill that was kind of a wall. As soon as he realized I saw him, he ducked down. I screamed and ran. My friend, not knowing what to do, just followed me. I told him what I saw, and at first he didn't believe me. But by the end of the day, he wanted to go back. So the next day we met up and headed back to the spot. This time there was no clown or anything. So we took the red stool and we were throwing it around, and eventually we threw it into this creek, and it sank to where you couldn't see it, and we walked away because the water was cold and we didn't want to die for it. We went back a week later, and the red stool was back where it was before. We took it and threw it into a dumpster nearby. Sure enough, a week later it was back. We wanted to get rid of it, we didn't know why, but we just thought it was a little game between us and whoever was doing this. This time we destroyed it and took each one of the legs and threw them into different areas. Some in dumpsters and some in the creek. I even watch as a piece of the stool floats down the river. I thought surely he couldn't find all the pieces of the stool and put it back. And I wasn't really putting the clown incident and this together because it had already been a few weeks. But a week later we came back, and the little red stool was there. Taped together, and at first we were like, wow, These guys are good, but then a thought ran through my head. There is no way the guy got all the pieces by finding them. I saw it float down the river. He had to be following us to get those pieces. Just as I was about to say something, we heard the same honking noise, but this time the clown wasn't hiding. The clown was standing at the top of this hill looking down at us. We ran as we heard laughter coming from behind us. We lost him and made it out. We went back a week later with a large group of 6 friends, and when we got there, we were shocked the paintings had been ruined and someone had written "Be impulsive" everywhere. We left soon after finding this out. Weeks later, we thought that was it, and we found this little abandoned shack, and we looked around and left. We went back a couple weeks later to the shack, and someone wrote "Be impulsive" on the shack. We actually got scared, and we just got out of there. A week later, the woods caught fire. And a week later, my friend got a little red stool right outside his door with the words "Be impulsive" written on it. He thought it was me at this point, and we got into an argument, and I don't speak to him anymore. But this will probably be my scariest childhood story. Why was he writing "Be impulsive"? Why was he following us? And creepiest of all, how did he know where my friend lived? Well, that's my story. I hope you liked it. I still get scared when I think about it, but it was 4 years ago, and it's over now. I went camping with my wife and dog up in Shasta. I've learned about meditation and CE5 contact and wanted to try it up there in the remote wilderness. First night, we're stargazing and see something looking like a star move across the sky in straight paths but in different directions 4 times through the span of an hour. Before going to bed, we see it blink brightly once in one part of the sky, then blink brightly in 4 pulsing rhythms in a different part of the sky. No activity after that. We went to bed in our little caravan and kept waking up randomly throughout the night, feeling a very heavy presence in the room. I'm usually a light sleeper, but for some reason, it felt like I had stones weighing my eyes down. I kept thinking that there was someone in the room, but it's questionable when you're half awake and half asleep. Next morning, my wife asks me if I saw the glowing diamond in the room, saying it was like a faint green color. I notice outside 3 weird square indentations in the ground, 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, with the heaviest indentation, which would indicate the head of anything being supported as it's the most weight-bearing point, pointing toward the side of our caravan. Our caravan has diamond-shaped windows. The next night we stay up very late trying to see if there is any outside light source that would shine through our caravan windows, and lo and behold, it's dark as duck. I've been questioning myself a lot these past couple of days and I'm looking for some kind of clarity. I was camping with a couple friends at a spot on the McCloud River called Adina. If you haven't been, it's a neat spot but very remote. McCloud town is small, and Adina is about 14 miles into the woods, 7 of which are a rocky dirt road into a canyon with a beautiful, pristine opal blue river at the bottom. The site was an old summer camp for a wealthy San Francisco family in the 1800s. There are still foundations of the buildings, an old chimney, and the remnants of an orchard. The campground is right on the river, and we went, as most do, to fly fish. It was early spring, and the river was really too full and fast to do much useful fishing on this trip, which is likely why we were the only people down there. On the first day, after no luck fishing, my buddy and his wife decided to take a snooze in their camper, so I walked up the river to try to find a spot to fish where maybe the river would widen out and be more workable. I walked through the old ruins and through the orchard before finding a trail to head up the river. I fished unsuccessfully for about 45 minutes, and it started to rain a little bit, so I packed up and headed back. Right as I was coming off the trail and back into the orchard area, there was an archway of vegetation that I had to duck a bit to get through to get back into the old orchard. Right as I dove in, I heard coming through the dense foliage a few feet above my head and no more than 10 feet what sounded like a horse pushing air out through its cheeks. It was a deep guttural sound from a large animal, and it sounded close enough to almost touch. I could see nothing, however, because the vegetation was so dense. I got real cold real fast and moved out of the thick stuff into the more open orchard. Then I froze. I could hear nothing. I couldn't see anything in the brush. I was kicking myself because I was carrying a sidearm, but it was in my pack. Idiot. Slowly I took off my pack, put it on the ground, and got my gun. Put on my shoulder harness and pack back on as slow and easy as I possibly could the whole time, intensely focused on sound but hearing nothing. This orchard is about the size of a football field, and the right side of which, where the sound had come from, is dense blackberries. So basically there is open space then the dense wood/berries where you can't see much. I started walking back through the orchard towards our campsite. The opposite end had a similar kind of dense arch-like spot to get out of the orchard and back into the ruin/campground area. I had made considerable ground and was intensely listening for sounds of something following me and had heard nothing as I made my way, so I was starting to feel like I was in the clear. Right as I let a little sigh of relief out while going through the exit arch, PPPFFFTTTTGGGTFFTPPP. The same sound from a similar height and just as close as before. I broke into a full sprint the rest of the way back to the campsite and got my friends informed. It was really wild. As I was running, I felt like my life depended on it. That night we stayed down there. Yeah. As we were cooking and eating, a deer showed up. The strange part was that as it got darker, the deer kept getting closer. By the time we were ready for bed, it was literally under the picnic table in the campsite. We had an uneventful night, but when we got up in the morning, the deer had slept under the pop-up camper right at the door. The next day we went back to the orchard. With our firearms ready, I was determined to figure out how the animal had moved without me hearing it through the dense berries. I searched and could not come up with a rational explanation. No paths. No trails. Lastly, and most disconcertingly, in the middle of the orchard there was a small pine tree, maybe about 12 feet tall. The weird part was something had broken the top off of it about 7 feet up and laid it across the vague footpath I had used to get through the orchard the day before. It was not there then. I've racked my head trying to make sense of this encounter. A bear obviously comes to mind, but what I get stuck in is the height of where the sound came from. Black bears getting to like 9 tall is not really a thing. And an animal that size having to move pretty quickly to cut me off does not seem possible over that distance through that thick of brush without a trial. I'm a touch over 6 feet, and this noise was a few feet above my head. The terrain would not have accounted for that plus a bear standing up. The other thing is, I do not understand how it could have cut me off at the other exit and made no sound getting there through the dense berries and trees. I was terrified. I don't think I've ever been listening more intensely in my life. There was no sound. I guess it could have been 2 huge bears, one at each spot, but I've never heard a bear make those sounds. The deer issue was also strange. We spooked the animal and made it feel safe. I have never seen that before. Anyway, it's a cool spot, and if I were Bigfoot, that's where I would be considering the orchard food source and limited humans for the majority of the year. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. Be safe out there. My experience was in Forest Falls, California. Friends of mine and I would like to be in the car and drive up there in the mountains, have a fire, or just sit in the darkness and look at the stars. On this particular day the snow had fallen, and it was about a week before Christmas. We are headed up to the top of the mountain, or the part you can drive to at least. We admire the Christmas lights and the trees lit up in windows before driving to the overlook. We are sitting in the car chatting and enjoying some coffee while looking up at the stars. It's probably 11 p.m. or so. All of a sudden we see a huge shadow come over one side of the mountain and into the street. My friend, who happens to be home on leave from the army, looks back and starts screaming like a girl, which makes me turn around to see a huge, 14-foot minimum figure standing there with an ink black outline that looks like a super tall man with glowing red eyes. We all see it, it stares at us, and the driver books it. We race down the mountain, and somehow it's pacing us. We get to the edge of the town limit where there is a bridge that leads out of the town, and it stops and stands on the bridge. We talk about what we saw, and all agree the thing was too large to be a bear and too human-shaped. It didn't run on all fours, and we didn't understand how the eyes would glow like that even if they were. Our friend who screamed says they felt like the thing was pure evil and never experienced anything like it. We end up deciding 2 days later to go back. We are all super curious to see if we can see it again. This time we have recorders, weapons, and flashlights. As we round up the roads, we notice that the top 3 streets are blocked off with tape. There was apparently a rock slide late that night we were there, and it came down on 3 streets of homes. Streets were small, maybe 3 homes per street, and the lights and Christmas trees we were admiring were still there. The families had to abandon their homes and go elsewhere. We all felt that the creature had something to do with it. Avid hiker and nature enjoyer here. I've got a couple stories. A recent one was on a pretty popular and well-kept trail in northern Wisconsin. I visited that trail frequently in my early 20s. It had a couple loops, ranging from just over a mile to a couple reaching nearly 7 or 8 miles. One year I noticed that someone or some group began to place animal bone effigies along various trails. These bones were cleaned and bleached, like a stark white without any staining. It started with just little bones inserted into rotting trees and stumps, and then I started finding bones tied together with twine into weird symbols, hanging from trees just off trail, usually significantly above eye level. Then I started to find entire deer limbs, shoved into hollows of trees or between boulders, still bloody and raw, but strangely avoided by insects. Eventually I started finding heaps of presumably deer meat just laying on a boulder off trail, dusted with forest detritus yet strangely uneaten by animals or bugs. I'm sure it was just someone pulling pranks or some wannabe witchcraft stuff. It was just odd because I walked that trail several times a week during all hours of the day from nighttime to morning or noon, rain or shine or snow, and never saw anyone hanging or arranging things like that. 2. Another time when I was 17 or so, I was backcountry backpacking in northern Minnesota with 2 friends for a week-long trip. On the second day of our journey, shortly after we began the hike for the day, we passed a guy with a huge black wolf dog, and he stopped and chatted with us briefly. He gave me ex-Marine or law enforcement vibes, but something about him and his dog felt uneasy. The dog kept whining and looking down the trail behind them, and the guy just seemed shifty and eager to get out of there. I noticed he had a pistol holstered at his hip, which didn't bother me at all, but what bothered me is that he seemed so on edge despite the security of a firearm. He told us he noticed a single middle-aged male walking off trail that morning in a dark green raincoat and just got bad vibes from the guy. Surely enough, later that day, the 3 of us noticed a figure in a dark green raincoat quickly step off the trail while we were walking on a long straight stretch, and we happened to glance behind us. For the next 2 days we thought we kept seeing him, only behind us, and believed we kept hearing footsteps in our campground at night. We took bathroom breaks together, never went anywhere alone, and it honestly really ruined the vibes of an already rainy and muddy hike. Every night we fell asleep damp and clutching knives, bear spray, and poop shovels like we were about to go out fighting. On the 3rd day of paranoia, we got to a campground filled with college-age girls, all being loud and overexcited and simultaneously scared of the woods. We thought sharing the camp would be good for safety. We warned them about the guy that we had been seeing, and their demeanor changed quite suddenly. They told us they had been hiking for a few days from the opposite direction and had encountered a married couple that warned them of the same guy. We thought it would be safe with them, but that night, we woke up to a girl shrieking, and then chaos broke out. Something crashed away into the woods, and a few of the braver people in our camp popped out of their tents with flashlights and headlamps. It turned out someone had tried to open one of the solo tents on the edge of the camp, and the girl inside woke up to a figure crouching half in her tent. She kicked at the figure, striking it, which immediately ran away. Some girls were getting absolutely frantic. I decided to gather some people together to start a bonfire, which was nearly impossible given the wet wood. Luckily I found a stand of rotten birch trees nearby and managed to harvest some bark for kindling, and had some people join me to keep watch until morning. We were supposed to have another 3 days in our hike but decided to call it a quits after that and called our ride to come pick us up from a different trailhead. I really didn't like hiking much after that, always feeling an overbearing sense of paranoia that someone in the woods was watching me. 3. My last story, I was solo hiking in Michigan when I was around 24. It was an old-growth forest, a really beautiful region. The hike was pretty but rather mundane and uneventful. I got a handgun for self-defense after the hysteria in Minnesota. It was supposed to be just 2 nights through a 12-mile loop of rather steep and hilly terrain. On my first night, 4 miles in, I got to my campground at the bottom of a valley. It was oddly still and quiet, no wind, and frigid for the season. There was supposed to be a creek running through the valley, but it had been dry, so I didn't have enough water for a good dinner and ended up snacking and preserving my water for the next day. I just couldn't sleep that night. It had been the first time I was solo backpacking, and I just felt vulnerable. I was maybe 20 meters off trail. It was so still and quiet out, I could hear random animals skittering about and the incessant whine of insects. I was laying there for what felt like hours when suddenly I realized there was no sound at all, no animals, no insects. It was like the world had been muted. That's when I realized the ground had started to rumble very gently. I perked up, and it sounded like there was a large group of people marching by, the familiar drum of boots on densely packed earth of a trail, but dozens upon dozens of pairs of feet. And the talking. It sounded like whispering at first, and then a cafeteria of people talking, distinct voices all saying and conversing, but not a word could be made out. I felt like I was going crazy, but I could even see my water bottle vibrating from the footsteps. It got closer, and the voices got louder, but I couldn't make out a word. I checked my phone, and it was 2 a.m. My heart was pounding. What could people be doing out here in the dark? Even through my rainfly, I could see the dim light of the moonlit sky through the trees, but I couldn't see any flashlights or lamps. It sounded like 100 people were passing by. I was shaking so badly and so scared when suddenly it stopped. My heart froze, and my throat caught a lump. It felt like I was surrounded with 100 pairs of eyes on me. I chambered a round in my pistol, took the safety off, and just lay there, not daring to move. And I waited and waited and waited. No animals, no insects, and no wind. And I waited. Then something freaking exploded. It felt like my whole world erupted, a shockwave passed through my body and rocked my whole tent. I thought I had let my gun off at first, but all 15 of the rounds were still there. My ears were ringing. It sounded like a jet had passed by. With the sonic boom, there was a roaring sound that quickly traveled away too. I nearly peed myself, and feeling a surge of adrenaline needing to pee really badly, I jumped out of the tent with my 10,000 lumen duck-u flashlight and quickly swept the sparse woods surrounding my tent, and swiftly dropped my pants and peed right outside my tent with a pistol in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I felt so crazy. I finished up and leapt back into the tent, saw it was 4 a.m. on my phone, cried a little, and hid inside my sleeping bag again. I waited until morning and finished the rest of the 8 miles that day on zero sleep. I haven't gone solo backpacking since. My partner and I recently bought a camper van and decided to take it out to a spot we had checked out once before. The spot is located approximately 10 minutes outside of Port Renfrew on Vancouver Island, BC, and sits near the end of the Juan de Fuca River. The camp spot is right above it. There is no cell reception for nearly 2 hours both ways, and it is down a dirt road off the main drag. We felt as if we were being watched from the moment we got there, but felt safe enough having a vehicle to sleep in versus a tent. The night went on, and we had a couple drinks, nothing major. It got colder and the fire was out, so we sat in the van, just listening to music. I had to pee, so I went outside the van. To my surprise, I began to see sparks and flames coming up from down by the water. I was a bit freaked out as it's really close to our spot and there is absolutely nothing and nobody out this way, so I headed back in the van to tell my partner. I got back in, and that's when things got completely ducked up. I started to see flashlights coming from the woods. It looked like a group of people, and I was starting to get really freaked out. I started to see flames coming as well, as if these people were holding both a mix of torches and flashlights. They were coming towards us and started surrounding the van. I thought we were never going to be able to leave. The same flames from a fire I saw coming from the river were now also surrounding the ground of the van. As if they set fire either below it or just surrounding it. From these flames, I saw the reflection of fire off of the figures. It was not pitch black like it should be. I could see the figures, their clothes, their outfits, and their faces. The first I saw was an archer. They were in green, and it almost looked like armor of sorts. They were wearing a mask. The mask was green with no special or intricate design, just the outline of a face. It grabbed an arrow from its back and aimed it at the van. I thought we were going to fucking die. Shadows were everywhere, surrounding me as far as I could see each way. As they got close to the van, I could see them in their faces. Multiple red armored figures, a mix of knight armor and scales, came around, and they had guns on their backs. They had masks on too, but they looked red and made of wood, again not intricate but not as simple as the green face one. There were hooded figures. They would walk in the deeper parts of the forest and just stare. 3 or more of them came to the front of the van and just stared in. They saw me, and I noticed them. They were violently pointing at me, and a few would point and then point at the exit of the site. I told my partner that they wouldn't stop pointing at me and indicating we should leave. He couldn't see any of them. He saw pitch black. There was so much going on. Besides these things I saw dark, almost purple knights. They had the full attire uniform and faces covered. Larger figures, too large to be humans, were in similar outfits, but their armor had spikes coming from every limb and angle. They all would take turns staring in and pointing. The ones in hoods had cell phones or cameras of the sort that would show me their screen through the window. On their screen was just a view of the van and us on the inside. It was seriously messed up. Animals began running behind them. If I could describe them, it would be a mix between an oversized lion and a demon. They stayed farther away. All while this is happening, there is what looked like women and children, but mainly children, being brought through the forest and were helped up the hill by these bear-looking creatures. 2 were black and the other gray. They had 4 limbs but were the height of a truck. I didn't sleep once that night. I stared out at all that was going on for hours. I tried to not see them. I told myself they weren't real. My partner told me to hide my face, but when I would lay down, I could just feel the piercing of them staring. I would remove the blanket slightly, and they would already be jolting their fingers at me or waving for attention. They wouldn't stop, and I was too scared to look away. The first second I saw them after the fire was near midnight. I sat up all night terrified, either waiting for them to leave or for the sun to come up. It was the longest night of my life. As the morning broke, they began walking back into the forest. They didn't fade or disappear, they left. All until there was one hooded figure left. He stayed until the sun came just past his hood, showing me the terrifying pale and hairless face. They were gone, and so were we, leaving at about 8 a.m. when it was finally bright. Before we left, I saw symbols painted on the trees. I have searched everywhere online to find what they mean, but no such luck. So much happened in one night that I've only added the main happenings and figures seen. There is no over-exaggerating in this, I am here for help. I wish I could unsee everything from that night. I need any information on what exactly these demons and creatures are. Do any of these sound familiar as demons or mythical creatures, urban legends, etc.? I just don't know what that night means. The site and forest itself felt extremely evil, and I am unsure if something terrible happened there or if it was once a place of satanic worship. Please, if any of this sounds familiar or you know of any happenings near the Juan de Fuca River, Ferry Lake, or Port Renfrew area, let me know. Me, my friend and my girlfriend were staying on top of a small mountain in a yurt in North Carolina for 3 days. The yurt was one large cylindrical room with 2 futons and a kitchen table. 2 doors to enter the yurt off of a porch that circled one half of the building. The first door was to the north and the second door to the west. The second door was closer to the futons, and the main entrance was on the north from the futons. First night we made dinner and fell asleep after our 9-hour drive. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. We went out hiking in the morning and had a full day, lots of fun. We came back, and I made dinner, and we passed out. That night my girlfriend woke up and had an extreme and sudden notion that the doors needed to be locked. She got up, locked the door, and went back to sleep. She claims she woke again in a sleepy daze to what looked like a black silhouette sitting at the dinner table next to the bed. She shook it off as a dream or a sleepy hallucination and went back to sleep. We went out again on our 3rd day of hiking and returned at sundown. I wanted to take a time lapse of the sun retreating over the mountains, so I ran up to the top of our little hill to set up a time lapse aimed down at the yurt. As I was doing this, my girlfriend and other friend were exploring a trail that led back into the woods of the mountain. We all went back in, and I left the camera shooting. I made dinner, and we ate. After I went up to the top of the hill alone to retrieve my camera. This is where things started for me. I took a piss by my tripod, and as soon as I finished this wave, what I can only explain as energy enveloped me. I all of a sudden had this image in my mind of something behind me in the woods slowly approaching me. Like a wall of fog or something. In my mind I kept having this image of a strange white figure that could have been like a humanoid tree kneeling by the ground and standing up, then sitting only to repeat this action multiple times. I know this was just in my head, it was like I could pinpoint where this idea was. So I grabbed my stuff and went in for the night. We all fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a huge bang on wood that sounded like the north door being hit. I was very tired and looked around, and neither my girlfriend nor my friend on the futon 5 feet away were awake. I shrug it off and fall asleep. I continue to have dreams as if my vision was just floating inside the yurt, slowly panning along the inner wall, looking outside of the windows for hours. Like I was standing in the yurt walking around, but I had no body, and there was no sound of me walking. Then I awake again to a huge bang at the other door, just 6 feet from the futon. Since my body was oriented towards it, I opened my eyes, and I was immediately fixated on the door, which had a full glass window with a shade. I watched intently, looking to see someone but nothing. In my head, I said, "Nope, duck this," shut my eyes, and went back to bed. Hours pass, and I wake up a 3rd time. This time I was on my side and didn't open my eyes. To my horror, I can hear a voice just outside. It was a sort of inflection more than words. It spoke in a way, like a person was speaking to another. I had this notion that there were 2 of whatever it was. Looking in as to say, "Look, you can see them right there." I was petrified, and I looked real quick to see the clock at 5:30 a.m. I once again said duck that to myself and fell back asleep. When we woke up, I said to my friend, "I don't want to alarm you, but I was hearing some ducked up shit last night." Both my friend and girlfriend said that they had also awoke to huge bangs. The weird thing is when each one of us hears the noise and wakes up. We had seen that all the others were asleep. I'd what this was, but I think I pissed off something by pissing on the top of its mountain. I live in the most northern part of Norway, which is also the most northern part of Europe. My home lies well above the Arctic Circle. This means for those of you unaware that we have very short summers where the sun never sets and very long winters where the sun never rises. Those long and cold months of darkness at the end and beginning of the year have made us into an understandably superstitious kind. There were many tales meant to safeguard us safe growing up. You have Stallo, the mountain troll who steals children who wander far away from their home. You have the Myling, who you will not see, but you can hear it stalk you, letting out the cries of a baby. And the Nook, who lie in wait beneath the surface of lakes and rivers, waiting to drown any unsuspecting swimmers. My story begins when I was 16 years old. I had just gotten my hunting license, and my father had even bought me a shotgun for my birthday. This was big for me as I had always followed my father on hunting trips as a child, but never had I actually shot grouse myself. My father is the stereotypical northern Norwegian. He knows everything about the outdoors, and he can endure any hardship or weather with the same unwavering sense of macabre humor. Once his fingers got stuck in a saw at his workplace and peeled the skin of his middle finger like a banana peel. He promptly bandaged it up by himself and kept going. He did not consider going to the doctors to get it looked at before almost 2 weeks had passed, and the stench of the bandages made him unbearable to stay in close proximity with. In the end, he needed a skin transplant and several weeks off work before his hand was remotely usable again. So the time of year comes when the sun is out for a few hours in the morning, and me and my dad take the journey to the cabin. This includes an hour of driving and a further hour of boating. You see, our cabin is in a remote area without any road access, so the only way to get there is by ferry. This means we somewhat always know who is out there since most people only stay over the weekend when there are no holidays and the ferry only goes Fridays and Sundays during the weekend. That being said, there are never more than a handful of people out there at the same time, spread out on an area that is roughly larger than my hometown. This time, on the other hand, it was only me and my father taking the ferry that Friday, so I knew we were going to be left alone over the weekend. Arriving on that small pier by the cabin, I could finally breathe in the fresh air of untouched nature that has always been soothing for my soul. It's like you leave behind all your troubles at home because out here they are irrelevant. At the cabin, the only things that matter are those that keep you safe, warm, and fed. We then dug out our snowmobile that was parked near the pier and drove the short trip over to the cabin. That night, we mostly spent preparing nose traps and lunch for the next day. My father told old stories of when he went hunting back in the days and such, and we shared in a ceremonial hunter's shot of single malt whiskey. I slept well that night, as I normally do when the peace and quiet of the cabin comes over me. We got out of the cabin late the following morning due to us just enjoying the calming of a morning with no obligations. This would turn out to be a mistake, however, you see, the key point is to be out early so you can utilize the sunlight as much as possible. We knew this, but sometimes you just want to sit down and eat a lazy breakfast and watch morning TV. When we had arrived at the Lavu, imagine a winter version of a teepee, that we had set up that summer next to a lake, which was now frozen, of course. My father decided that he would take it easy that day and get the Lavu warmed up so that when I returned from the mountain there would be warm food and drink waiting for me. I had previously spent a lot of time by myself around the area, so walking around the mountain alone never bothered me and still does not to this day. So I started walking up the mountain overlooking the lake. It was difficult due to the heavy snow and me not bringing my skis. Instead, I opted for using an old pair of snowshoes that was hanging in the cabin. This resulted in me using way more time than needed to get up to where I could find some grass I might shoot. I knew from previous experiences that this was an area they would be in. After a lot of effort, I made it up, and the area, despite being full of tracks and feces, was abandoned. You see, it had snowed that night and part of the morning, so the tracks must have been somewhat fresh, yet I could not hear or see anything. So I stalked the forest upon that mountain for an hour without any traces of life. That is probably when I noticed the silence. It's like what people with similar experiences say, there is always this deafening silence that preludes something bad. Like all the animals know to get out there. I remembered for the first time since childhood that I felt uneasy about being alone up there. But of course I was not about to go empty-handed back to my father, so I continued. As I was walking around, listening intently to any sound that might give away any other form of life, I remember being amazed at how loud my footsteps were. At this point, I was a tall yet skinny boy around 70 kilograms / 154 pounds. Even though I walked as slowly and controlledly as humanly possible. The uneasy feeling was creeping closer and closer to the point where I decided to take a quick snack break and regain my previously calm state of mind. As I walked back to a clearing overlooking the lake, my footsteps seemed to almost lighten, and I felt more relaxed and at ease again. I sat down on a rock and ate a bar of chocolate I had brought and enjoyed the sun on my face, ridiculing myself for being spooked by what essentially was nothing. That's when I heard the footsteps coming from the direction I had just been in. Loud and heavy footsteps of a grown man. I know this because, as anyone can tell you, the sound of a biped walking on 2 feet is quite distinct from four-legged creatures such as moose or bears, especially in heavy snow. I tried calling out because I immediately thought it was my father who had a change of heart, yet no reply. I sat there on the rock, watching the direction of the footsteps as they grew louder and louder. Several times I called out, and yet I received no reply. Feeling uneasy again, I decided to take out my phone and try to call my father. There on my phone, I had an unread message from my father delivered 3 minutes ago. Coffee and lunch are ready. Simultaneously, the footsteps were somehow getting louder and louder, and I knew whatever was at the other end was not my father. This, and knowing that we were supposed to be the only two people in a radius of many, many kilometers, made me instantly jump up. I grabbed my shotgun and knocked out of there as soon as I had tightened my snowshoes. As I was making way at all heists, I could hear whatever was stalking me pick up the pace. And I realized that the sound of my own footsteps and whatever it was that was after me was almost synchronized to the point that there was only a slight difference in when our feet hit the ground. I realized since then that whatever it was had followed me since I had entered the forest on the mountain and was the cause of why I felt like my footsteps were abnormally loud. I remember trying my best to run in hip-deep snow, not caring that the thick layer of branches hit my cold face, leaving red marks all over. It came to the point where I could hear the extra pair of footprints no more than maybe 5 meters behind me, yet when I turned around, there was nothing. I pushed all I had, and when I finally managed to reach the frozen lake on the other side from the lavoo, the extra pair of footsteps just stopped. Exhausted by the kilometer-plus run in high snow, I made my way to the lavoo. My father seemed almost amused by how tired I seemed. He handed me a hot cup of coffee and asked if I saw anything. I didn't know what to say and was honestly embarrassed by what had occurred, so I said only that I had spotted many tracks yet no birds. However, in later years, I have asked him about this and other strange occurrences around the area, and the answer has always been roughly the same. Don't worry about it and don't ask about it. Some things are better ignored. When I was younger, between the ages of 10 and 13, my parents and I lived on an old country road in Alabama. It was enough in the country that our backyard was thousands of acres of woods and a decent-sized cow pasture. I spent every day after school and every day of the weekend out in those woods, to the point I knew the place like the back of my hand. I saw and heard a lot of weird things in these woods, but I'd like to talk about the time I believe me and my friends encountered a shapeshifter. 2 of my friends came to hang out one Saturday. We'll call them Derek and Will. We went out in the woods to just goof around like all kids do. We were talking about video games when we suddenly heard a loud snapping sound, which we assumed was a stick. We all looked to see what was kind of worrying because there was a rumor that a panther lived in those woods. Me and Will couldn't see anything, but suddenly Derek pointed to a tree and said, "There's someone behind that tree." We looked over, and sure enough we could see someone looking from behind a tree. They were far away enough that we couldn't see a lot of details. What we did know was they were about 5'8", they had long black hair, and they had on dark clothing. This description did not fit any of our friends or anyone that lived in this area. Will started yelling at this person to come out from behind the tree. After about 20 seconds, the figure disappears behind the tree and comes out the other side. But instead of this figure, it was my dad. For context, my dad stood at 6'2", had short white hair, and was dressed in a camo jacket. Nothing like what we just saw. He comes up to us and starts talking to us, asking what we were doing. All of us were clearly uneasy, but we just told him we were walking around the woods. Then my dad laughed and said he was heading to the house. There was a clear, wassy path back to the house about 20 feet away, but he went into the woods, taking a much more rugged path that would take a bit longer to get to the house. Immediately when he was out of sight, we ran to the path and quickly went to the house. When we got there, my dad's truck was not there. We gave each other concerned looks, but we decided to go in the house and ask my brother-in-law if my dad just left. When we asked him, he said my dad had left over an hour ago, and you could tell he was serious. Afraid of being laughed at or called crazy, we didn't tell him what just happened to us in the woods. When my dad got home, he was wearing completely different clothes. We were desperate to believe he was the one in the woods, so we asked him, "What were you doing in the woods earlier?" To acknowledge him being in the woods, not saying that we had directly talked to him in case it wasn't him we talked to. He told us he was never in the woods. We might have thought this was a joke at first, but that didn't explain how he looked like an entirely different person before coming around the tree. To this day, I believe it was a shapeshifter, and I have no idea what they wanted. My experience with the help calls, oh man, that is scary. The scariest night of my life has to be when my husband and I went camping in the off-season and were basically hunted by a psychopath. Long story short, we had heard a horrific car accident while getting ready for bed in our tent. A super windy, dangerous road led up to the camping areas, so we were immediately concerned about someone being in grave danger and potentially with children at that. Without a single word to each other, we hopped up and ran in the direction we heard the wreck take place. We got there the same time just about as police and ended up giving our info if needed and heading back to our campsite. I was pretty pregnant at the time, so I really had to pee after all the running and adrenaline. We decided to stop at the only restroom open at the time, which was a bit past our campsite and incredibly dark without other campers around creating light. After I used the restroom, I'm walking back out to my husband when I notice behind him a flashlight frantically bouncing up and down from someone booking it towards the restroom. Jokingly, I chuckled about this guy must really be needing to use the bathroom, but it was a very short-lived moment. This man stopped dead in front of us and basically whispered, "Wow, you guys are fast," and then smiled in the most unnerving way. It absolutely sank my stomach immediately, heartbeat pounding in my ears, instant nausea, goosebumps, you name it. Husband didn't seem put off by any means and noted we were worried about the accident. Ect. Dude continues on as if discussing the weather with a friend, saying he's just used to that kind of stuff, and asks if we're leaving tomorrow. I almost angrily asked what, which he shrugged off and just explained he traveled a lot and camped. At that point I had already started taking steps backwards to the point where my husband finally starts noticing something's off with at least me. In the moment, I decided to lie and say we needed to get back to our tent because the cops were coming to take our statements. Which was completely false, but I, for whatever reason, just fabricated that like verbal vomit without even thinking. Even though my husband chimed in and agreed, saying we needed to get back, this man does not stop. He starts matching our steps backwards with steps forward towards us and begins telling us that morning he went for a walk and found these beautiful flowers, but had heard a deep growl, which scared him. He ended this very concerning story by saying he realized you never know what day is going to be your last. It was at that point that I realized the entire time he had been fiddling with his hands in his hoodie pocket because he had a knife. I screamed run, and without hesitation, my husband grabbed my hand, and we started running for our lives. In those first few moments of taking off, he asked me what was going on, and I screamed, "Flowers don't growl," and started sobbing. This man had never taken the flashlight off us, he had it in one of his hands by his hoodie pocket the whole encounter, so we knew he was chasing us when the flashing became erratic again, shining up and down over us. I'll never forget watching our shadows go from big to small with the movement of his hand while running hard. I looked back to see him behind us with the same smile he had in the beginning, and it absolutely terrified me. We had to cut through some woods because he was gaining on us so fast, and in the heat of the moment, we decided to just continue through the woods back to the police instead of staying on the road we would come up to after cutting through. We both looked back and last saw him right at the edge of the road where we would have come out if we had decided to take that way, because it would have been the fastest to the wreck. We knew we made the right decision immediately and knew it was a life or death situation in that moment. It clicked for us that he had expected us to take the road and looked disappointed that we took the longer route instead. We didn't see the flashlight or him after we looked forward again, and when we told police, they went and failed to find the guy. Fast forward to a couple years after this traumatic experience and dozens of unsuccessful follow-up calls to see if they ever found him. I decided to post online about it. It went viral overnight, and by the next day someone who lived in the area had actually found this guy and shared a news article. He killed 2 weeks later at another campsite not too far from where we went. He attacked and stabbed a man, who died immediately, and a woman, who luckily survived but only by playing dead. When I tell you finding this out absolutely sent me into a spiral, I mean it. I cannot even remotely begin to describe the mixed emotions of getting closure from him having been found to the heartbreak and survivor's guilt of knowing he went on to successfully kill because he wasn't caught after our experience. This changed my life. I'll never be able to enjoy camping again, and we used to love it. I frequent a small parcel of western North Carolina that has a reputation of being an evil place. I've talked to locals that said they've heard and seen giant beings crashing through the woods. One even told me he was chased by one while he was driving a four-wheeler when on a hunting trip. Nearby there is a spot that is supposedly home to a witch and rarely trekked due to its reputation as well as its difficult terrain to navigate. Anyways, I've fished, hiked, and canoed this area dozens of times for about 6 years now and never heard or seen anything out of the ordinary except for 2 occasions. One was about 5 years ago. I made a late-night trip to the area to fish along the rip-rap of the dam on one of these lakes. They are high-altitude lakes and pretty remote, like you're pretty much never going to see anyone else out there at midnight remote. It was a pretty typical summer night, probably mid-60s, clear, with bugs and frogs making their summer noises. Fish weren't biting, but oh well, I was out there enjoying myself. I was walking a small section of beach by the rip-rap, a stretch of about 50 yards wrapped around a small point that extends into the lake a bit. I had walked this spot back and forth for about 45 minutes to an hour when I felt like something was wrong. You know, those random something bad is going to happen type feelings that you can never trust to be legitimate or not. Just as I started getting that feeling, I noticed the woods and lake went quiet, no frogs, no bugs, nothing. And about the same time everything went quiet, I noticed a fog slowly rolling out from the back of the lake where it's fed by the main creek. As it rolled towards where I was by the dam, the temperature started to drop signify, or at least it sure felt like it. By now I'm incredibly bothered but telling myself stuff like this happens and not to scare myself out of there because it was quite a haul to get up to this lake from where I lived. As I'm walking the bank I have walked over and over that night while fishing, I noticed something I did not see in the several dozen times I walked back and forth while fishing, a neatly placed pair of boots that I would have absolutely noticed before because of where they were in relation to the water and where I was walking. By then I had enough and got out of there as soon as I could. I thought about that night often but continued to go to this place to fish and didn't have anything else occur until last November. A good friend of mine decided we wanted to meet up and do some camping. We decided we wanted to camp at a little spot only accessible by canoe on this lake. It was projected to be a mild November weekend, with highs in the mid to high 50s and lows in the low to mid 40s at night. We got all of our things set up and had a good time fishing during the day, but as we were heading back to camp with the canoe from the back of the lake, my friend tells me he just had an awful gut feeling that we needed to pack up our stuff and go home. We had been planning this trip for a while, so I convinced him it would be alright and we should just go back and get a good fire set and get an early night's sleep to fish more in the morning. We went back and got a fire started and noticed it was getting very cold very quick. At this point I was a little uncomfortable, but we had 0-degree rated bags and a good fire going, so we figured we would be okay. Right before we went to bed, things got a little spicier. My friend told me he was getting an awful feeling in his stomach once again, and at the same time I started having the worst migraine I had experienced in my life. I took some ibuprofen and tried to sleep, but neither of us could, and the weather seemed to be on the downswing. The temperature was becoming very uncomfortable, and winds were starting to make our tent slap, which was not a great sound with a migraine. Then the noises in the woods started. Periodically we started to hear what seemed like something taking a large, thick stick and slamming it against trees, maybe every minute and a half or so. I had heard of knocking before, but this sounded more like slamming. This would not stop, and at this point my friend and I are loudly discussing packing up and leaving, but we're discouraged by the thought of packing the canoe and taking it back about 3/4 of a mile back to the boat launch. It didn't take too long to convince ourselves to do so, and we began the task of breaking down our entire campsite in the freezing dark while I am in vocal agony with my migraine. Eventually we get everything backed and send off into the dark water towards the launch. We had an electric trolling motor on the canoe that should have had about a half battery of charge, but it died about 2 minutes into the trip back. At this point it is now blowing flurries of snow, which was not called for by any weather predictions, and we are paddling with a canoe full of gear into the night. We finally made it back to the car and got everything packed by about 1:30 in the morning. Both of us began feeling much better just about as soon as we started getting out of this particular area, and we agreed we both felt like we were very unwanted by the land. We made it back to my apartment about 3 a.m. and slept in warm beds. Glad we made the call to leave. Neither of these stories are particularly crazy, but they are two incidents where I truly felt there were influences at play that I did not understand. I spent a lot of time in the woods of Appalachia. Backpacking, fly fishing, hunting, foraging. The woods are my second home, and I have spent many nights comfy and content in the dark Appalachian woods. Those 2 nights were different though, and I don't think I'll ever know why. This happened outside of a little town called Milan located in Tennessee. This was easily over a decade ago. Me and a buddy had gone to a friend's house for his birthday, and being out in the country, we had a little bonfire going and a few beers. In total, there were maybe 6 or 7 of us. We stay out drinking, enjoying the night hours that go by. It's probably about 10 or 10:30 when I'm noticing the fire getting low. Now there's a tree line about 30 or 40 feet away from the fire, and I've been sipping on liquid courage all night, so I walk towards the tree line. I'm walking into the tree line, and I hear my old friend Jeffrey say he's coming. I see him 34 feet away with a flashlight heading towards the tree line. I then walk another 5 feet or so into the woods, looking for logs. A few moments go by, and here's Jeffrey coming into the woods. As he raises his flashlight at me 10 feet or so behind me into the woods, something starts running heavy. And it was knocking down small trees. Whatever it was had been watching me for a few minutes before Jeffrey came into the woods. Jeffrey bolted out of the woods, which startled me because he grew up hunting. But whatever this was scared him of. When we got out of the woods, I asked what the hell was that, and he was lost for words. I saw him a few years back and brought it up. Just talking about it, he had the same look of terror on his face he had all those years ago. Whatever it was big, bigger than me. And at that time I was roughly 225, and it sounded like it was double or triple my weight moving through those woods. What's creepy is my father had a similar story when he was roughly my age at the time. I'm sharing this for the strangeness of it, but also because I'm looking for an explanation. 5 days ago, July 7th, I was visiting my 2 friends, Jake and Ryan, at their house in South Michigan. It's in a pretty rural area, their house is set back into the woods off a quiet road, and the rest of the surrounding area is mostly farmland. Neighboring houses are several hundred feet apart. There's a road that branches off the main road, which loops around a large grove of trees. It connects to their driveway as well as their neighbors' driveways, then connects back to the main road. We often like to walk this road at night without flashlights because, with the tree cover, no natural light is able to reach the ground. Just before 11 p.m. on my second to last night there, after sitting around a bonfire in the backyard, we decided to do that exact walk. Earlier in the night, Jake and I thought we should try to scare Ryan. So while we were walking off their property, Jake and I quietly picked up a few things to throw into the darkness to startle Ryan. He grabbed a large branch, and I got a pine cone and a smaller branch, then we set out. Along the walk, Jake threw his large branch, then I threw my pine cone, then there was a third sound that wasn't either of us, and then I threw my branch. Jake and I are acting afraid of the noises, but none of our attempts seemed to affect Ryan. We made it around the bend of the road and were coming up on where the trees cleared and the moonlight illuminated the ground. Though we were still in the pitch blackness, we could see the light as we approached it. Jake suddenly stops in his tracks and says, "Wait. I hear dragging." I assume he's joking, so I play into it, but then I hear it too. About 30 to 50 feet in front of us, there's a loud dragging sound against the asphalt. Whatever it is, it sounds very heavy. I feel my entire body run cold. The sound stops, and we all stand still to listen, then it starts up again around 15 seconds later and quickly stops. I try to use my phone's flashlight to light up the road, but even at the most powerful setting, it only reaches about 10 feet in front of us. Ryan quietly says to us, "Ready, guys?" Then dramatically breathes in and lets out one of the most deafening yells I've ever heard in my life. Why this was his first instinct I don't know, but he later said it was a survival mechanic. We stay still, then the dragging starts again, almost sounding closer than before. Not wanting to stick around to let it get closer, the three of us take off, running back the way we came. We reach the bend of the road again and slow down because we assume whatever it was didn't follow us. Then we hear a branch snap in the woods to our right and run all the way back to their house. They told their parents what happened and that the yell wasn't anything to worry about, and they don't think much of it. About 20 minutes later, we all decide to head inside. Their dad stays outside to put the fire out, then comes in and says to us, "There's either an owl outside or something imitating an owl." Which may be one of the most frightening sentences anyone's ever said to me. We go to the screen door to listen, and there's a clear patterned owl sound very far away. There's also another, louder, closer, and less patterned sound that sounds like it could be an owl but could also be something else. The sound stops, and within the hour we're asleep. The next morning we take the long way, driving off their property along the same path we walked the previous night. There's nothing to be seen in the area where we heard the sound. No branches or logs on the road, no evidence of any dead animals. At the closest neighbor's house, which is a few hundred feet from where we heard it, we see the local feral cat sitting on their driveway, so we get out to say hi. The neighbor, who is likely in his 40s, was in his garage and saw us and came out to talk to us. Ryan asks him if by any chance he was doing any work outside around 11 p.m. the previous night. He says he wasn't. He and his wife were asleep upstairs by that time. We've thought about the incident a lot and can't come up with a logical explanation for what was causing the sound. Laloyan, hermit of the Swiss forest. 2015 March. Every day for the past decade, an unknown person has been patrolling the forests of Switzerland. Without fail, this person walks an identical route through the forests and mountain trails, which has evolved into something of local folklore, usually spoken in whispers and stifled giggling. All this changed when a reported photo of this individual was published. All of the reports that have been made down the years say roughly the same thing. In addition to a military-style uniform, whoever this is has a long cloak or a trench coat that has witnesses and the populace torn whether this is a man or a woman. To add to the confusion, a vintage gas mask conceals this individual's face. The general assumption is that this is a man in some form. From this conclusion, different people have different ideas. Some believe that they have seen a spirit or ghost. Others reckon that this is a living hermit or bushman who has done nothing more than reject modern life and other creature comforts. More extreme ideas can be counted among the more recent. Someone might have hedged their bets and come to the conclusion that the world is going to end soon and is making preparations to that end. Perhaps this is a woman who has a mental illness and is looking for her soulmate. In the middle of a Swiss forest wilderness. If not her, then perhaps a man with a terrible skin condition who grew tired of ridicule and withdrew from civilization only to be glimpsed occasionally. He, or she, is a sinister-looking individual that, probably unintentionally, tends to frighten anyone that comes forward as an eyewitness. Despite this reputation, there is no apparent threat or malevolent behavior toward witnesses at all. One reported sighting even went as far as making the point that flowers were in the hands of this person. Swiss police have long sought a dialogue with whoever this is, not because a crime has been committed, or indeed is a likely outcome, but simply to inform them that their appearance is, at best, unsettling. When the photograph was taken by the witness's mobile phone and went viral, interest in this person hit an all-time high. Compared to sightings of the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland, this person quickly earned himself/herself a suitable nickname, Loloyan. This witness provided an account of the encounter that hindsight has determined to be benign and passive, but at the time the witness was so disturbed by what he saw that he chose to remain anonymous. They found themselves almost within touching distance of each other and exchanged glances before Loloyan turned and walked away from the witness and his family. The witness took the snapshot after settling his family down. He took the photo with added care and caution, just in case. Another witness that was happy to be identified was local resident Marianne Desclous. Her encounter with this strange person took place in 2013. Desclous didn't go into a lot of detail but did admit that the sighting was unpleasant and not something she was keen on repeating. Her description was strongly similar to many of the others, but on the day of her sighting, it was raining persistently. Even though Loloyan has not displayed any harmful intent whenever spotted, there are some people who are not prepared to take the chance that this will never happen. Many families will no longer venture into the woods in order to reduce the risk of meeting this person, and even fewer women will visit the forest alone for the same reasons. As the end of 2013 approached, French website Le Matin published a suicide note that was discovered in a forest alongside Loloyan's trademark outfit. The note said that increased scrutiny had made suicide a much more preferential decision. In closing, the note mentioned 19th-century Austrian author Stalker Mazoch. Mazoch entered into a relationship with Baroness Fanny Pister that was unusual for the time. He signed a contract that compelled him to do whatever she wanted him to do. Pister was also required to wear a fur coat whenever she felt in a cruel mood. It was this relationship that gave the world the term masochism. Is this a clue to Loloyan's true identity? A lot of people don't believe that this suicide note is a literal one but just a case that Loloyan began to feel uncomfortable with the heightened awareness of their existence and took steps to put an end to it. No corpse was recovered at the scene. Smoky Mountain Campground Experience. For my lady's birthday, I took her to Gatlinburg, a popular, touristy, one-main boardwalk town in the Smoky Mountains, Tennessee. We camped the first night, a few miles out in the woods at a popular location, Elkmont Campground. The campground was beautiful, tall green trees, like baby redwoods, a clear water river scattered by checkered rocks, families with little ones running around. Through borrowing a tent, we found that we had no stakes and headed into town for supplies, whiskey, and hot dogs. It was dusk by the time we made it back to the campground. Most campers were surrounding their dissipating fires or cleaning up before the quickly becoming night. Our tent was still up but crunched up without the stakes allowing it to spread open as widely as it could. We fixed our tent and started a fire. As our night progressed, we found ourselves surrounding our campfire 2 to 3 hours later, around midnight. Now this was the sort of campground where another campsite is just 30 yards from yours. Bears frequent the area, and my girlfriend was already freaking out a little bit, which is why I booked our site in the dead center of the whole campground. All the other campers had gone to bed at this time, and the only sound we could hear was the slowing crackle of our fire and the light stream of the river flowing into rocks. The clouds were covering a crescent moon, so there wasn't much light to begin with. We had flashlights, and I'd occasionally shine the light around us, while avoiding hitting other campers, to confirm that we were fine and there were no bears with binoculars in the bushes spying on us. Seemingly out of nowhere, from the campsite behind my girlfriend and to my left, a light shined directly on us and then all around in a frantic yet focused manner, like the eye of Sauron. What appeared to be a man, with the strangest gait I've ever seen, wore a headlight and was focused on his picnic table. The man's gait seemed to me a bit like Jar Jar Binks. Just not normal. Through a peripheral stare of my own, the man focused his light on the picnic table, and whenever I turned my head toward him, immediately his light would hit my girlfriend and me. I could only see the outline of the man through the light of his headlight and the occasional flash of my light at his campsite once he continued to flash his light at ours in a very disconcerting way. This was the campsite across from us where we saw no one all night prior. I could only see the outline of his body as all black, as if he were in an all-black bodysuit. His movements were eerily repetitive. For what went on for close to an hour, this man would shine his headlight on his picnic table, make limited motions with his hands, if any at all, then walk 5 steps back to his tent, shine his headlight at his tent, walk back to the picnic table, shine his light at us, then all over. If this was just a man looking for something, he was on a cocktail of drugs. Once his light was on us for too long for comfort, I shined my flashlight on him for an extended time. It was at this moment when I went from annoyed to fight or flight. A chill ran down my back, and I saw the outline of the man disappear in front of me, and the light from his headlight bounced down to the ground and then flew across the ground from his campsite and seemed to jump along the ground and into the bushes diagonal from both our campsites. Not as if the headlight had been thrown, but as if it ran across the ground. I took my flashlight light away and watched his light slowly come back out of the bushes and climb back up to the height of a person. The shadow figure returned back, walking out of the bushes and back to the campsite to continue the odd behavior. There were no sounds at all coming from this figure through the entirety of the night. Some time later, we went into the tent for shut-eye, and the Shadow Man figure was still at his odd routine. The following day, the tent from Shadow Man's campsite was gone, like no one was ever even there. I then found out that just a mile from our campsite was a small town called Elkmont Ghost Town, with abandoned buildings and a cemetery up a trail a bit. I couldn't find any other stories of Elkmont mysteries, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's other stories involving a headlight man. Lurking in Lake Michigan. I'm 28F. I live in Illinois in a suburb of Chicago near the lake. A few months ago, in the middle of the summer heat, I went with my boyfriend to this little hidden beach off of Sheridan Road by Zion. The road to get there is a long straight road passing a small metro train station and some small roads leading to abandoned buildings and small warehouses. You park to the left of the dead end. From there we walk down a concrete path and go down this winding path of dirt and overgrown grass, trees, and flowers, kind of like a trail at a forest preserve. You walk over some old, out-of-service train tracks covered in all types of flowers and greenery, so you know that's been there a long, long time. Keep walking. Walking is probably a 10-minute walk till you start to see the sand. There's a short boardwalk overlooking the water and another to the right for sightseeing. I've lived here my whole life. I'm 28 now, and I just found out about this secret beach a few years ago. Not a lot of people know about it, and I never see more than maybe 2 to 6 people at a time here when I come. But this particular day we seem to be the only ones there. I'm a psychic/witch/tarot reader/mystic, and I've always gotten such a beautiful welcoming energy from this place. On this day it felt a bit lonely, a bit calmer than usual. The waves seemed very calm and slow. No loud crashing against the shore. I can't swim, but I love the water. I meditate deeply next to water, and it gives me such a blissful feeling of peace. My connection to the spiritual world is strong, so my spirit guides and higher self speak to me regularly and easily. I'm starting at the water, and my guides say, "It's so beautiful. Get in and feel the water." I go in about ribs deep and just feel the waves, submerge myself, and enjoy the freeing feeling. My boyfriend is lying on the sand just watching me. After a while of being in the water, I start to notice this ominous fog slowly coming toward the shoreline. I start hearing my guides saying, "Something's coming." Something about the energy I was giving off was attracting something to me. Like a beacon, and as I think this in my mind, I see a clear picture of the necklace I'm wearing, like I'm being told that's what's doing it. It was a necklace of a crystal. A fluorite crystal gives off strong aura energy. I made it myself. I hear you need to get out of the water and, like, as if I'm in a movie where I'm going to get dragged down into the water by something I can't see, I start running towards the sand. The fog at this point is thick, and it's a sunny day. Everything was silent, like something out of a horror movie. The waves felt like they went silent. I get out of the water, and my boyfriend is half asleep, asking what happened, and he got really creeped out. As we're talking about it, the fog starts to recede, and everything feels like it's coming back to life. Needless to say, we packed up and left. To this day, I wonder what was in that water. And it got me thinking. This is Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan has its own Bermuda Triangle for those of you that didn't know. So many people have gone missing by the lake, or dead bodies are always found. I wonder what was in that area the day I was there, and who knows what would have happened if I didn't listen to my intuition and got out of the way. Who knows what kind of creatures lurk in these waters. Back in 2001, when I was 18, my older brother, me, and 5 of our mutual friends traveled to Colorado for an ultimate frisbee tournament, but while we were there, we planned on climbing Mount Massive. We planned on camping out at the base of the mountain for a few days and starting early in the morning one day we would climb and summit it. When we arrived at the rough campsite, no one was in the area, and it appeared no one used the camping area at all. But what was strange is you could hear this faint static, almost like when you are flipping between radio stations in the background. At first, we thought maybe a radio was on the ground somewhere, but we searched all around for a source and never could find anything. But it didn't sound like the noise was coming from anywhere, it was just all around us but very faint. So we just thought about it and ignored it. None of us really talked about or believed in any paranormal stuff at this stage in our lives, so we carried on setting up camp and cooking. That night I became extremely ill. I was dehydrated and had some altitude sickness. I felt awful and didn't want to sleep in the big tent we were all using, so I got the keys to the van we used for the trip and climbed into the driver's seat and chugged a bunch of water. During this time, my brother came to check on me and decided to just sleep in the van. I was in the driver's seat, and he was in the front passenger seat. While I was sitting there feeling terribly nauseous and ill, I kept seeing two bright orange lights behind the van kind of pulsing and moving around slightly. My brother asked me if I was messing with the lights, and I said no, I'm not doing anything at this point. I turned around and got a good look. I saw two bright orange orbs or lights. Around this time, the rest of the group from the tent yelled to us, asking what we were doing and what the lights were. At this point, I figured they were messing with us somehow with remote lights on the van or something. And I felt so sick I didn't really process it well, and I didn't care. I just rolled over in my chair and went to sleep. We talked in the morning trying to figure out what happened. They showed me the van didn't have any remote lights or anything like that, plus I had the keys. I didn't touch anything on the van. I simply opened the door and climbed in. I remember very clearly the two fairly large orange orbs. I don't know what they were, I just remember seeing them pulse with a slight humming noise. It's very strange how totally indifferent I was about them, which normally wouldn't be in my nature at all. I can't believe I didn't investigate further. We ended up climbing the mountain and taking off from the area the next day. Nothing else strange happened. True story of my encounter within the Louisiana piney woods. Even at the age of 42, memories of a chilling night from my 14th year remain as vivid as if it happened yesterday. Now, my own eerie story isn't drenched in blood-curdling visual details. In fact, I never actually laid eyes on the entity that visited that fateful night. My mindset has always been open to the possibility of what's often referred to as purgatory, a place where lost souls linger, unable to move on due to unresolved trauma. These lingering spirits may occasionally manifest as ghosts, offering us glimpses into their spectral world. Yet, up until that fateful night, all the ghost stories I'd ever heard seemed to take place within the confines of houses and buildings, never out in the open, isolated woods. Unfortunately, on that particular night, my understanding of the supernatural took a sinister twist. During our summer breaks, my family, parents, brother, and me, would embark on week-long visits to stay with my grandmother and Aunt Pat in the piney woods of Castor, Louisiana. Castor was a quaint, isolated town with nothing more than a single stoplight at its center and a classic general store, seemingly untouched by the relentless march of time. My grandmother and Aunt Pat's homes, however, were nestled deep within the dense, foreboding pine forest. Across the street, Aunt Maury and Uncle Henry occupied a house, and there were only two other neighbors within miles, one residing a mile down the road, and another 2 miles away toward town. To provide a mental image of the surroundings, both homes were situated on vast tracts of land, primarily dense pine forest interspersed with low-lying, swampy patches. Aunt Maury and Uncle Henry's property boasted a sizable garden on one side, complete with a substantial chicken coop at the rear. Their ample yard was enclosed with T-posts and barbed wire fencing up to their driveway. As for my grandmother's residence, it was a small, aging house perched atop a gentle hill. Her long, rocky driveway terminated with a cluster of trees right in front of her home. Given the limited space, my younger brother and I would spend the nights during our visits sleeping on the living room floor, nestled in sleeping bags and blankets. The night I can't forget began with me waking in the eerie stillness of midnight. My brother was snoring softly nearby, and Aunt Pat's snores reverberated from the other room. I sat up and glanced at the old square digital clock with its red numbers. It mockingly read 12:01. I tried to relax, but my attempts were futile. It was at that very moment, a mere second after I lay back down, that a faint, rhythmic clinking sound emerged from behind Aunt Maury and Uncle Henry's house. The noise was subtle, demanding my utmost attention to discern its rhythm. It continued for a minute or so before vanishing into the night. I shrugged it off and closed my eyes once more. However, as I was about to drift back into slumber, the sound returned, slightly louder this time. I couldn't ignore it. The noise was unmistakably a metal-on-metal clinking, adhering to the same consistent rhythm. It seemed to be coming from behind my aunt and uncle's house, close to the chicken coop. I figured it was Uncle Henry, patching up some holes that unwelcome critters often used to sneak inside. The noise ceased after a minute or two, and I leaned on one elbow, waiting to see if he was finished. But that's when it got even stranger. The clinking sound started again, but this time it appeared to be coming from the front of their house, near the end of their driveway. I was thoroughly confused. Why on earth would Uncle Henry, an elderly man, be engaged in fence repairs at the stroke of midnight? The noise became clearer, and the familiarity of the metal-on-metal sound gnawed at my consciousness. It ceased yet again, leaving me perplexed. I waited, half expecting to hear the familiar clinking sound continue. Suddenly, an icy chill ran up my spine, and the hair on my arm stood on end. The sound resumed, unmistakably coming from the middle of my grandmother's driveway. I knew in that heartbreaking moment that this couldn't possibly be Uncle Henry's doing. Whatever was making that eerie sound wasn't human. I felt paralyzed by fear, my body rigid as I cowered beneath the covers. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, my entire being was frozen in terror. The eerie clinking sound started again, this time right on my grandmother's front porch. I glanced around the room, bewildered that no one else had been awakened by the cacophonous noise, just inches from the very door I lay in front of. In sheer panic, I buried my head under the covers, avoiding any contact with the outside world. The antique door had built-in glass shutters, not fully closed, and I could feel something, some presence, staring at me, peering into the room. My gut told me this had to be a dream, but it was also terrifyingly vivid and real. My dreams rarely made any sense, let alone being so unnervingly realistic. With my hands clutching the blanket tightly over my face, the only thing I could do to ground myself was to bite down hard on my right index finger knuckle, inflicting pain as a brutal reminder that this was reality. With my eyes squeezed shut, I eventually succumbed to exhaustion and drifted into a fitful sleep. When I finally awoke, it was with a start, and my body filled with a sense of shock. Everyone else in the household was already up and about, cooking breakfast. As I gathered myself, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had clung to me. I felt compelled to ask my grandmother about the existence of railroad tracks in the area, as the rugged, hilly logging country didn't strike me as a place where such tracks might be laid. Her strange, hesitant look as she answered my query sent shivers down my spine. She confirmed the presence of an old, abandoned railroad track, less than a mile behind Aunt Maury and Uncle Henry's house. It was a relic from a bygone era, most likely built by enslaved hands. Concern etched her face as she inquired if I was feeling okay. My face had become completely white. 2 strange short stories. 1. So this happened roughly 15 to 18 years ago. Me and my cousins and my sister, we were 9 to 13 years old, were playing in an old lumber mill. As we were running through it, exploring it, we suddenly came to a stop and decided to leave. As we left and came across a T-junction, roughly 70 meters from the lumber mill, on the road, we decided to keep exploring and went towards the right. Just before we turned, I looked back, and on the road that goes underneath parts of the lumber mill, we saw an old man sitting in a foldable chair. We didn't think too much of it at the time except thinking it strange for him to be sitting in the middle of the road. So we keep going to the right on the road. We walk for less than half a minute and realize that this road only leads into a forest, so we head back. As we walk past the lumber mill, the old man is gone. This is just less than a minute since we last saw him. We keep walking home after that. We were trying to figure out how he got away so fast at his age. Maybe he was actually younger than we thought and got up and walked away with the chair just as we got out of sight? That's the best excuse we could come up with. 2. So this happened roughly 6 years ago when I was 24. I was going to bed, and just as I got down in bed, I noticed some light through the window. My first thought was that it might just be a car, but the light got brighter, and I looked around in my room and noticed that the light was covering every corner of my room. Not a single item in my room was casting a shadow. It all happened so quickly, and then after roughly 5 to 10 seconds, it was just gone. I thought it was thunder, but there was none that night. Maybe a car, but a car has never done that before. I swear my horse is an all things creepy magnet. He's been grabbed once and stalked multiple times. Since I was little, I've been able to see things and feel the paranormal, knowing more about Fae than I should, like drawing the Leah Fail, old Fae portal from their world to ours, near perfectly with cranes when I was like 3 years old and wasn't even told the word Fae or fairy. I, female 20, bought my first horse, a weanling 8 months, colt boy, when I was 16. I named him Lugos, different spelling of the Celtic sun god Lugu who fought in a Fae war. It was the only name he answered to when I called it, as I was trying to name him when he was 2 months old. I've been with horses for over 10 years by then, so I know things pretty well. A few months after I got him home to the barn I worked at, he'd just come home from the hospital, and it was a hot July. He and his 2 older buddies were inside during the heat of the day, and only at dawn and dusk. The day went normal. I got there in the morning, now I was 17, fed, let out, and cleaned stalls, then brought in just before noon and went home for a swim and nap. I came back before sunset, so 7 p.m.ish. I put them out, cleaned again, and made their dinner. I got them in around 11 p.m. The barn lights were broken, so it was dark inside, and after dinner, I hugged my horse goodnight. When he then turned his head to his back leg, I thought there was an itch he couldn't reach, so I reached down, and my hand was covered in blood. I pulled my phone flashlight out and saw his back legs were cut up, and he had a coronet laceration. I called my mom, and she came over to help me clean and bandage the wound. I looked all over the pasture that night with a flashlight to see if there was any sign of how he got hurt. Nothing. We knew the vet wouldn't be able to help that late, so the next morning I called. He couldn't do anything because of where the wound was and just told me how to treat it. All was fine and went on like normal, except when I brought the manure out to the compost. I always take the same route, but this time there was clean, squeaky clean intestines from a small animal laying there in front of me. Like someone washed them and put them there for me to find. I asked the barn owner and neighbors, no one knew anything about it. I felt uneasy, it felt like an apology, but I know enough to bury it without a thank you. I then remembered feeling watched these past days at the barn. I always brushed it off because it wasn't scary and didn't feel like I was going to be hurt, but now that this happened, I was rethinking the wounds on my horse, and I looked back towards the woods. The pasture is between a road and forest, with a cornfield on the other side of the road and giant power lines on the other side of the forest. The pasture nestled halfway into the forest. The wounds on my horse looked like something grabbed his back legs. The cuts/scratches were as wide as my fingers, and the laceration was deep and wide, starting from his hoof and moving up, perfectly crescent-shaped. Like a sharp blade or claw did it. He also had a scrape on the opposite side of the coronet wound hip bone up near his back. I don't know if it's connected, as that is a common place for a horse to bite when playing but can also happen from falling over. He wasn't dirty when he came in, so I don't think he fell. I never found anything that had blood or a sharp edge in the pasture. But the feeling it was something that did it never left, so we called some friends over, told them nothing, and asked what they felt walking the pasture. One was an older man named Jim. He said he felt uneasy, like there was something stalking the woods and trying to get in. The next two to come over were a younger couple called Moon and Adam. They were told nothing yet said the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Plus, Moon said she felt like there was a lot of activity here, possibly a portal between worlds. I then got my old iron horseshoe and sat it on my horse stall wall on the outside. It was barely put there, wiggled between the wood. A few days later, when my horse was only outside when I was there, a massive rainstorm hit, with wind and lighting. That night I was feeding. They came inside just after it hit out of nowhere. My mom was helping me get them in and leave ASAP, but the power cut, the barn shook, and I glanced outside into the rain to see the barn owner's husband, who lives on the property's car, almost flying from the wind. He made it inside and told us we can't under any circumstances drive until the storm passes, and we are welcome in the basement. Us being us, we say thanks, but we'll stay in the barn to watch if we need to release the horses. My mom is a witch and started a spell to protect the barn. The wind got worse, and I had to hold the door closed as it tried to open. Horses are scared and restless but safe in their stalls. Not even 30 minutes later, the storm stopped. The storm lasted a few hours, so when we looked out, there were trees fallen onto the fencing, T-posts bent, and extremely muddy. We looked out the other way, power still off, to see more fallen trees and broken fencing everywhere, along with 2 fire trucks with sirens racing past us, followed by a storm chaser car. Glancing at each other, we check horses are good and run after them 2 to 3 houses down to find a massive tree had fallen over the road. No one hurt, but this being the main road into town, they had to clear it ASAP. We asked the storm chaser why he's here. He said there was a tornado. No sirens went off, it had come out of nowhere. He said it was heading straight for the horses' pasture and barn but dodged us last minute and went into the yard of a couple houses down, taking a healthy tree out by its roots. The next day some friends, including Moon and Adam, came over to help fix the pastures up. They immediately noticed that thing was gone, no more feelings of being watched or hunted. We think it left when the power went out, as it was stuck between the electric fence and power lines. He healed without lasting damage, just scars on his legs and a nasty scar down his hoof. My thoughts on what it was: a fae got trapped and tried to take my horse with them or ride him out so they could leave, like the fairy tale tales, but hurt him and was sorry. Why I think fae is from the apology. Intestine is the best part of a kill, and that I felt safe. Lugos was not shook up like he was attacked. I never have felt uneasy or unsafe if fae are around or could be, and I felt like I almost knew it. I had other sightings at that barn that had nothing to do with the horses, such as a silver man and a bunch of shadows. Oh, and the horseshoe that was barely put there took me 20 minutes to get off the stall when we moved. It was stuck, and I have no idea how because when I put it there it was just lightly wiggled between boards. That fall we moved. I took my horse and leased one of the older buddies for him. I moved with my parents to a small farm on the countryside, a small land with a barn and fields on all sides and forest past that. The house has ghosts, a 120-year-old house. But for the first few years nothing happened with the horses or anything creepy. that is, until I was at the back of the pasture at night putting hay out a few weeks before October 31, 2023. I was far from the house and barn when I froze in place. Something was on the other side of the pine trees. There's a line of pine trees between the pasture fencing and fields. This thing, unlike the last, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I felt uneasy. When I looked up, I saw something darting behind the trees. It was breaking its height to be taller than me. I'm 5, it was shadowy with yellow eyes and an animalistic movement yet human at the same time. Its arms touched the ground as it went back and forth weaving behind the pines, the back legs bent under it, the neck was thick, and the head was always pointed at me, so I didn't see the side profile. I almost could see fur, but it moved so fast. That same night the collar remote from my neck went missing, from my neck. I looked around for a few minutes and found it sitting a few feet from the fence line that the thing patrols. A few days before, I had to yell at my dog for going into the field behind the house, the same one that thing is next to. My horses refused to go over there at night, and I kept my dog out of that after that. On the night of the 31st, we had Moon and Adam over for pumpkin smashing and a bonfire. I asked them to come for a walk with me in the pasture. Once we got into the pasture, my horse Lugos, who is now 3 years old, came up for huggies and followed us along. He never tries to stop people by walking in front of them. I taught him that's a no-no as he is massive. As we neared the place the creature stalks, he tried to push Moon back the way we came and tried to stop her and Adam from continuing, but we ignored him and walked on while he stood there watching us. That's when Adam stopped and pointed at the trees, saying, "What was that?" He was shaken, said something darted between the trees, and described what I've been seeing. They got the heebie-jeebies and noped out back to the bonfire at the other end of the property. A couple days later at work, they pulled horseshoes, iron horseshoes, from my favorite horse there. I got to keep them and put them at each corner of the property. The thing didn't come back. My thoughts on what it was, no idea. I didn't feel like I knew anything about it, and I didn't recognize it. At this property, I've seen gnomes in the fields, ghosts in the house, and fey traps, aka the leaves and corn, waving me over when there is no wind. One night I was inside the barn with my horses, sitting in Lugo's stall just chilling when I heard footsteps on the roof. I froze, looked at my horse, and saw he heard them too. His head was up and ears were forward, listening, same as my other horse. I heard it walk from the front of the barn over my horse's stall and then stop directly over the stall I was sitting in with my horse. I was still sitting on the ground. I looked at the window that the stall has, half expecting to see someone poke their head down from the roof, but nothing came. We sat there for a good 30 minutes in silence, just listening to the footsteps walk around the roof. This thing was human size and had 2 feet. If it wasn't the middle of the night and everyone else was asleep, I'd have thought someone popped up there. But we didn't have a ladder or any reason to be up there, and more importantly, after midnight. It finally went away, and I waited a bit before scrambling out the barn, locking all doors and windows. Horses were staying inside that night because I was not going to put them outside with whatever that was. My thoughts on what it was, again, no clue. The last story I'll add is a good one from this year, 2024. My contacts broke and I had no glasses, so I could barely see, but my 2 horses broke out and ran down the road. I chased them, forgetting my phone, and only had a halter and bucket of grain. The dirt road was luckily empty, and they went over a mile down it, running through yards and fields, until I couldn't see them but a yellow and a brown blob. My family was grabbing a car as I went on foot. I started crying, fearing I'd never catch them or they'd be hit and killed. I spoke out loud, asking anyone who would listen, please let them come home. Just after I said that they turned around and the colored blurs got bigger, I saw someone with black hair and a long red shirt walking my brown horse named Calavera. He's 16 feet 1 inch but they were tiny compared to him, their heads just past his chest, I'd say 4 to 5 feet. I thought it was the owner or kid of the owner of the house they were just at. I shouted, "Thank you, I'm so sorry they got out." But as I got closer, this person was gone. I know I saw someone, it was clearly a person. I know what you're thinking, that I didn't see anyone but a trick of the light because I didn't have glasses. I would have agreed, but I could tell you how long their hair was, haircut, clothes, and build, and how they were walking with my horse leading him home. They ran past me, and I caught Calavera in a neighbor's yard, walked him home, and Lugos followed. They were unharmed. I still don't know who it was, but I'm grateful they brought them home. My thoughts on what it was, either a spirit or a god came when I called for help, I don't know who. I've got 2 stories. My wife and I have had a couple creepy AF incidents. This one happened near Hope, BC, way up in the mountain. My wife was more freaked out than me, maybe I'm downplaying this? In this scenario. The second one I'll write about scared me shitless. We were camping in the literal middle of nowhere, between two mountaintops. It was forest fire season, so we could only have a small propane fire. Anyway, we finally decided to go to bed and climb into our tent. We're lying there and talking, and by this point it was almost completely dark. All of a sudden we see through our tent wall, it's not see-through, a glowing purple ball that starts where I assume was the tree line and then up into the sky, and we could hear a light buzzing sound. And then it went silent. I grabbed my rifle and went outside and saw nothing. As if nothing happened. I chalked it up to a power line that broke, but we've both explored the area earlier in the day for fun, and there were no power lines. Nothing on Google Maps either. Not that creepy sounding, but in the moment it was a WTF moment. My wife hasn't camped in a tent ever since. That was 7 to 8 years ago. This instance happened about 5 years ago. My wife and I flew down to LA and rented a camper van and drove it east to go to Zion, Bryce, and Dead Horse, I think it's called. We were on our way to Moab from Bryce Canyon and we're on a highway I can't remember somewhere in Utah. I have planned our trip based on where we would camp each night. Everything was via Google Earth, so I couldn't tell what was what. So one of the places I planned to stay at, we had to go down this dirt road for miles and miles towards something that looked like a cool camping spot from Google Earth. We get to the spot, and the thing I saw on Google was a cool giant, and I mean massive rock/boulder, and a very small mountain, more like a giant hill, kind of growing into it. We set up camp there. The ground was untouched and seemed like no one had ever been there before because the dry soil was very soft and you would leave deep footsteps in the dirt, and there were no tracks anywhere, not even animals. So I go to the mountain and collect some wood for a fire and some large flat rocks to make a wind guard, as it started getting very windy all of a sudden. We noticed some ravens on top of the rock, cawing at us and kind of flying in a weird circle around the area. We joke about how maybe this is a warning, and it reminds me of the Halloween episode of The Simpsons where Bart is a raven. Anyway, eat in bed. I wake up in the middle of the night randomly, and my body is covered in goosebumps, and my hair on my entire body feels like it's standing up, and I start getting anxiety. I feel like someone or something is just outside of the van. The wind is blowing hard, and our van is rocking a bit from it to make things worse. I'm laying there not moving in fear that something is peeking in when my wife says to me, "I'm really freaked out right now and don't want to be here." I didn't know she was awake as well, which justified the way my body is responding. She later told me she had chills, and her hair was also standing up. I say, "Okay, F this, we're out of here." After mustering up the courage to move, I climbed to the front of the vehicle and got it started and drove out of there, slowly so as not to drive too fast and crash. We get maybe a few hundred meters away, and the wind died down, and both of our anxiety and fear went away, which creeped us out more. We went back to bed except I slept with my axe, like that would help, lol. We slept well. I woke up at daylight feeling fine, and we both said hell no to making breakfast here as we didn't want to get out of the van. The kitchen was only accessible through the back doors. I drove a couple kilometers away until we felt safe enough to get out and take our morning pee. We were still shaken up from the night before and didn't know what the hell that was. We didn't see any footsteps in the dirt around where the van was parked when we were driving out there in the morning, aside from our footsteps, which led to our makeshift fire pit. We were so freaked out by whatever happened the night before that when we got to Moab hours later, we rented a hotel and didn't want to sleep in the van overnight. Years later we were watching a documentary about missing people in parts of the US close to national forests and found out the area we were in was a hot spot, and we were close to Skinwalker Ranch. Crazy stuff I will never forget. I'm getting chills typing this. Scary experience in West Virginia. Now, my grandma used to take me camping when I was a child, and I did a girls' camp in the summer in the mountains when I was a preteen where my friends and I would often wander off into the woods together. As a child, I played in the woods for hours with my brother. It was always fun and always felt safe and never eerie or creepy. Most of my time in the woods as a child and a teen was joyful, fun, and adventurous. When we were in our 20s, a friend of mine in DC organized a women's survivalist training camp for a group of our female friends, maybe 7 to 8 of us. I can't remember, I had never been to West Virginia, but the land was beautiful and the roads were terrible. We had rented a cabin at a campground with multiple cabins on site, and during the day, our guide and teacher would take us out and teach us cool things, like local medicinal plants or how to make rope out of milkweed. A West Virginian extended family was having a large family reunion at the same time, and 2 to 3 of their girls about elementary school age started hovering around our classes, to be around the big girls, I assume, so cute, and they already knew most of what we were learning. We had a great time in the woods and on the land with no creepiness the first nights? I can't remember. On the last night, The owner of the campground had a big bonfire with hot dogs and marshmallows to roast and cider, and everyone who was renting a cabin was invited. It was after dark, and it was either a longish walk or a short drive, but on the campground land, so my friend A and I decided to walk. We were having a nice walk and a nice chat when suddenly we got a bad feeling, and we both went quiet at the same time. We acted nonchalant but glanced around to see what we could see. On our right was a cabin that looked deserted. It was totally dark, no lights on, no lantern out, but there was a single spot of light, the red embers of a cigarette burning. We could barely make out the figure of a man sitting there in the dark, smoking. We stayed quiet, but picked up the pace. We checked in with each other once we approached the big house and were finally in the light of the bonfire. Was that creepy to you? Yes, that was creepy to us. Had we felt creepy before out here? No, we had felt calm and safe. The land hadn't ever felt creepy to us before, but the guy sitting in the dark had given off a terrible menacing vibe, even 20 feet away, before we even saw him. We told some of our friends, and they just laughed it off and told us we had been afraid for no reason. It was perfectly safe here, they said. He was just another camper, probably with that West Virginian family. We were just paranoid, they said. Other than that, we had a great time at the bonfire, chatting with other campers and with the owners, who were very nice. When it came time to call it a night, the owners offered to drive us back, and A and I happily agreed, wanting to avoid another walk by that terrible cabin. We got back safely, without incident, and the owners wished us good night. Now our cabin had 2 levels, the ground floor and a loft level. The ground floor was one big open room with a few beds and, if I recall correctly, a table and chairs and a fridge and maybe a stove. I was on the ground floor with about 3 other girls, and A was on the loft level with 2 to 3 other girls. I often have insomnia, and I did that night, so I just stayed awake in the dark while everyone else fell asleep around me. I was awake for hours just thinking my thoughts until I heard the crunch of gravel outside, like someone walking on it. I nudged my friend V, who was the closest person to me. V, there's someone outside. V mumbled and told me it was just a deer and to go back to sleep. Okay. V was of no help. I got out of bed and crawled over to the window to see if I could see a deer outside crunching on the gravel. I saw instead the red glow of a cigarette and could faintly make out the silhouettes of 2 men in the darkness. Now the cabins were not close together. They weren't far, but they weren't close. We were on a bend of the camp road where there weren't other cabins. The closest one was a short walk away, but it wasn't like running across the street or next door or anything, and it was not visible behind trees and brush. Anyway, the closest cabin was far enough away that there was no reason for 2 guys to be smoking about 100 feet behind our cabin in the dark. I nudged V again. V, there's 2 guys out there. Shut up. It's a deer. Go to sleep. Now my boyfriend at the time had basically bought me all of REI to go on this trip. Our guide had asked us to bring a large knife, and he had bought me a large hunting knife, but also a little camp hatchet. I don't know what I thought I'd be able to do with these, but I grabbed both and just huddled under the window in the dark, waiting. Suddenly, a car alarm went off. All the cars were parked in front of the house. Groans came from the other girls. Shut your ducking car alarm off. Whose car is that? It's not mine. I said, I think it's mine, found the key fob, and turned off the alarm. Silence. I sat in the dark and waited. Her car alarm went off again. The other girls lost it. Hey! Shut off your ducking car alarm. I'm trying. She finally got it to shut off again. I crawled over to V. V, there are guys out there, and I think they're ducking with A's car. Shut up. It's just a deer. Go to bed and leave me alone. Okay then. The car alarm went off again. A. Shut off your car alarm. The other girls groaned. She did. The car alarm went off again. A. What is wrong with your alarm? Go out and fix it. She turned it off. I'll go out there, but will someone go with me? I will, I said. And I'm turning the lantern on, so FYI. I came down the ladder. I went up to her and whispered, "Hey, there are men out there, and no one will believe me. They keep saying it's just deer, but I saw them smoking in the back. You can't go out there alone. I'm going to go out first with the lantern so at least we can see around the cabin." We put our shoes on, and I turned the lantern on, opened the door, and walked onto the porch, lantern in my left hand, hatchet in my right. I hung the lantern up on a little hook on the porch. It was very bright and lit up the whole clearing in front of the cabin and the whole little parking lot for the cars. For the moment at least, we couldn't see anyone there, nor any deer. I tentatively walked down the front steps and walked around her locked car, trying the handles. No alarm went off as she tugged on each one. She came back up the steps. Nothing. See, it wasn't a deer, I said. Even with you trying to get into your own car while it was locked, no alarm. Your alarm is not that sensitive. Someone was trying to break in. We went back into the house, locked the door behind us, turned off the lantern, and sat inside in the dark, waiting for our eyes to adjust. Told me she hadn't been able to sleep as well and had been laying awake in the dark up in the loft, feeling uneasy before the first alarm went off. I told her I wondered if someone had tried to lure her out there alone in the dark and had been scared off when two of us came with both an extremely bright lantern and a hatchet. We stayed there together quietly chatting, in the dark, for hours, waiting to see if anything else would happen again. The car alarm did not go off again. Finally, enough time had passed that we decided to go to bed. The car alarm was quiet for the rest of the night. That was our last night there, so in the morning we packed up, and I drove back with A. If a zombie apocalypse were to ever happen, I'd pick A for my team because she listened to her gut feeling and worked with me as a team to keep each other safe. I write this to encourage people to listen to their gut feelings out in the woods. It could keep you safe.